The galaxy burned in the fires of civil war, and the Imperium of mankind stood on the precipice of annihilation. 7 years had passed since the drop site massacre at Istvan V, where Horus Lupercal's treachery had been laid bare in the most brutal fashion imaginable. The killing fields of that volcanic world had witnessed the systematic slaughter of 3 entire Space Marine legions, their gene-forged warriors cut down by those they had once called brothers. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard had been broken that day, their primarchs either dead or missing, their surviving warriors scattered to the stellar winds. The aftermath of Istvan V had sent shockwaves throughout the Imperium that reverberated still. What had begun as whispered rumors of rebellion in the outer reaches had crystallized into the horrifying reality of the Horus Heresy. The War Master, once the Emperor's most beloved son and the architect of humanity's greatest conquests, had turned his face from the light of Terra and embraced the ruinous powers of chaos. 4 entire Space Marine legions had followed him into damnation: the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, the Emperor's children, and the World Eaters. The Word-bearers had been the architects of corruption, their dark apostles spreading the cancerous doctrine of chaos worship throughout the galaxy. The Iron Warriors had brought their expertise in siege warfare to bear against the Imperium's fortress worlds. The Night Lords had unleashed their reign of terror across countless systems. The Alpha Legion had sown confusion and discord through their labyrinthine schemes. The strategic situation that emerged from this catastrophic betrayal had fundamentally altered the balance of power within the galaxy. The traitor forces, now calling themselves the War Master's legions, controlled vast swathes of Imperial space. Their fleets moved with impunity through sectors that had once been bastions of Imperial authority. Forge worlds that had produced the war machines of the Great Crusade now turned their manufactorums to serve the War Master's cause. Entire planetary systems declared for Horus, their populations either genuinely converted to his cause or cowed into submission by the brutal efficiency of his military machine. The loyalist forces found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts, their communications disrupted, their supply lines severed, and their command structure fragmented. The Ultramarines, the largest of the loyal legions, had been caught off guard by the Word-bearers' assault on Calth, their homeworld of Mukrag threatened, and their Primarch Robute Guilliman forced to fight a desperate defensive campaign in the Ultramar sector. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson had become embroiled in a shadow war against the Night Lords, their pursuit of the traitors taking them far from Terra when they were needed most. The Space Wolves had been manipulated into a devastating conflict with the Thousand Suns at Prospero, leaving both legions severely weakened, and Leman Russ's warriors scattered across the galaxy. The corruption of Horus Lupercal himself remained the most devastating blow to the Imperial cause. The Primarch who had once stood as the Emperor's right hand, who had led the Great Crusade to its greatest triumphs, had been transformed into something altogether more sinister. His fall had not been sudden but gradual, a slow poisoning of his soul that had begun on the feral world of Davin. There, in the depths of an ancient temple dedicated to the Chaos Gods, Horus had been mortally wounded by a blade tainted with the essence of Nurgle. The warrior lodges that had spread throughout his legion, seemingly innocent brotherhoods that cut across the rigid hierarchies of the Astartes, had been the vector through which the corruption had spread. The healing ritual performed by the Word-bearer's chaplain Erebus had been the final trap. In the warp-touched depths of the Serpent Lodge's temple, Horus had been shown visions of a future where the Emperor ruled as a god, where the Primarchs were forgotten, and where humanity had abandoned the imperial truth in favor of religious worship. These visions, carefully crafted by the Chaos Gods, had played upon Horus's deepest fears and resentments. The sight of the Emperor enthroned as a deity, while his sons were reduced to mere legends, had shattered something fundamental within the War Master's psyche. The physical transformation that followed had been as dramatic as the spiritual corruption. Horus's once noble features had become marked by the touch of chaos, his eyes now burning with an unholy light that spoke of powers beyond mortal comprehension. His armor, the magnificent Worldbreaker plate that had been crafted by the finest artificers of Mars, had been reforged in the fires of the warp. The Eye of Horus, once a symbol of unity and conquest, had become a blasphemous icon that adorned the banners of traitor forces across the galaxy. His very presence had become a conduit for the malevolent energies of the warp, his words carrying a power that could turn loyal servants of the Emperor into fanatical devotees of chaos. The War Master's strategic genius had not diminished with his fall. If anything, it had been enhanced by the dark gifts of his new patrons. The campaign that followed the drop site massacre had been a masterpiece of military planning, combining conventional warfare with the reality-warping powers of chaos. Horus had understood that a direct assault on Terra would be futile without first weakening the Imperium's ability to respond. His forces had struck at key industrial worlds, disrupting the production of weapons and supplies that the loyalist forces desperately needed. Forge worlds had been corrupted or destroyed, their Titan legions either turning traitor or being annihilated in the process. The march on Terra had been inexorable, a tide of corruption and destruction that swept across the galaxy. Star systems that had known peace for centuries found themselves battlegrounds where space marines fought their own gene brothers in conflicts that defied all logic and reason. The traitor fleets had grown stronger with each victory, their ranks swollen by turncoat Imperial army regiments, corrupted Mechanicum forces, and the dark spawn of chaos itself. Demons had begun to manifest in real space with increasing frequency, their presence a testament to the growing influence of the warp upon the material universe. On Terra itself, the Emperor had found himself facing an impossible choice. The Webway Project, his grand design to free humanity from its dependence on warp travel, demanded his constant attention. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in chambers that existed partially outside normal space-time, the Emperor maintained a psychic vigil that prevented the forces of chaos from pouring through the breaches that had been torn in the ancient Eldar construct. The project had been sabotaged by Magnus the Red's psychic warning about Horus's treachery, the Crimson King's desperate attempt to contact his father, having shattered the psychic barriers that protected the human sections of the Webway. The Emperor's confinement to the Golden Throne had left the defense of Terra in the hands of others. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor and the first of the Imperial Regent, had taken on the burden of coordinating the Imperium's response to the heresy. The ancient Psyker's powers had been stretched to their limits as he attempted to maintain some semblance of order in the face of galactic civil war. His network of agents and informants had worked tirelessly to gather intelligence on the traitor forces' movements, while his administrative genius had kept the machinery of Imperial government functioning despite the chaos that surrounded it. The recall of the loyal Primarchs to Terra had been a desperate measure born of necessity. Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, had been the first to answer the call. His legion's expertise in fortification and siege warfare made them invaluable for the defense of the throne world. Dorn himself had thrown himself into the task of preparing Terra's defenses with the methodical precision that characterized all his endeavors. The Imperial Palace, already a fortress of unimaginable scale, had been transformed into something that defied conventional military thinking. Entire districts had been converted into killing grounds, their streets and buildings designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined zones where they could be destroyed by concentrated firepower. The palace's defenses had been expanded far beyond their original parameters. The Eternity Wall, the massive fortification that surrounded the inner palace, had been reinforced with additional weapons emplacements and shield generators. The Saturnine Wall, a secondary line of defense, had been constructed to provide multiple fallback positions for the defending forces. The Daylight Wall, facing the primary spaceport, had been turned into a fortress within a fortress, its battlements bristling with macro cannons and void shield projectors capable of bringing down attacking aircraft and orbital assault craft. Jaghatai Khan had brought his White Scars to Terra with characteristic speed, their bike squadrons and fast attack vehicles providing the mobile element that Dorn's static defenses required. The Khan's warriors had been tasked with conducting rapid response operations, their ability to strike quickly and withdraw before the enemy could respond, making them ideal for disrupting traitor assault formations. The Primarch himself had struggled with the constraints of defensive warfare, his nature more suited to the open steppes of his homeworld than the confines of Terra's urban sprawl. Sanguinius had arrived with his blood angels in the final months before the siege began, his legion's reputation for savage close-quarters combat making them invaluable for the brutal fighting that everyone knew was coming. The angel's presence had provided a much-needed boost to morale among the defenders, his nobility and grace serving as a stark contrast to the corruption that approached from the outer system. The Blood Angels had been deployed to the most critical sections of the palace's defenses, their gene seeds flaws carefully monitored to prevent the Red Thirst from compromising their effectiveness at the crucial moment. The strategic withdrawal to the Sol system had been conducted with the precision of a master chess player sacrificing pieces to protect the king. Loyalist forces throughout the galaxy had been ordered to fall back to Terra or to conduct delaying actions that would slow the traitor advance. The cost had been enormous, entire sectors abandoned to the enemy in order to concentrate the remaining loyal forces for the final battle. Refugee fleets had streamed into the Sol system, their holds packed with civilians fleeing the advancing tide of corruption. The outer planets of the Sol system had been fortified as secondary defensive positions. Mars, the red planet that served as the heart of the Mechanicum, had become a battleground in its own right as loyalist and traitor tech priests fought for control of the ancient forges. The Jovian moons had been converted into weapons platforms, their surfaces covered with orbital defense installations that could engage enemy fleets at extreme range. Even Luna, Terra's ancient satellite, had been transformed into a fortress, its underground cities serving as staging areas for the final defense. The traitor fleet's approach had been detected by long-range augur arrays months before their arrival in the outer system. The size of the armada had been staggering, thousands of vessels ranging from massive battleships to converted merchant haulers pressed into military service. The sight of the vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, at the head of the fleet had sent a chill through even the most hardened defenders. The ship that had once been the pride of the Great Crusade had been transformed into something altogether more sinister, its hull bearing the marks of chaos corruption and its weapons capable of bringing ruin to entire worlds. The final phase of the Horus Heresy had begun with the traitor fleet's translation into real space at the edge of the Sol system. The die had been cast, and the fate of humanity would be decided in the battles to come. The Emperor's great work hung in the balance, 10,000 years of human progress threatened by the ambitions of a fallen sun and the malevolent powers that whispered in the warp. The Siege of Terra would be more than a military campaign. It would be a battle for the very soul of humanity itself. The transformation of Terra into the ultimate fortress began in earnest as the traitor fleet's approach became inevitable. Rogal Dorn had thrown himself into this monumental task with the methodical precision that defined his character, treating the fortification of the throne world not as a desperate last stand, but as the greatest engineering challenge of his existence. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists understood that conventional defensive thinking would prove inadequate against the forces arrayed against Terra. This would not be a siege in the traditional sense, but a collision between two fundamentally opposed visions of humanity's future, where every street corner and hab block would become a potential killing ground. The Imperial Palace itself had already been a fortress of staggering proportions before Dorn's modifications began. Covering an area larger than many continents, the palace complex had been built upon the foundations of the ancient Himalayan mountain range, its spires reaching into the upper atmosphere, while its foundations delved deep into the planet's crust. The palace's original architects had designed it to be both a seat of government and a symbol of imperial might, but Dorn recognized that symbolism would count for nothing if the walls could not hold against the War Master's assault. The construction of the Eternity Gate represented the pinnacle of Dorn's defensive philosophy. This massive portal, standing nearly a kilometer in height and fashioned from adamantium and ceramite composites, served as the primary entrance to the inner palace. The gate itself was a marvel of engineering, its surface inscribed with protective wards and equipped with void shield generators that could withstand direct hits from Titan-class weapons. The approaches to the Eternity Gate were designed as a killing field, with overlapping fields of fire from concealed weapon emplacements and carefully positioned obstacles that would force attacking forces into predetermined channels where they could be systematically destroyed. The defensive networks that Dorn established throughout the palace complex defied conventional military logic in their scope and complexity. The Saturnine Wall, a secondary line of fortification that enclosed vast sections of the palace, had been expanded with additional bastions and redoubts. Each section of the wall was designed to operate independently, with its own command structure and supply lines, ensuring that the loss of one section would not compromise the entire defensive network. The wall's battlements were equipped with macro cannons capable of engaging targets at extreme range, while closer-in defenses included rapid-fire autocannons and flamers positioned to sweep the approaches clear of infantry. The daylight wall, facing the primary spaceport and the most likely avenue of approach for the traitor forces, received particular attention from Dorn's engineers. This section of the defenses was transformed into a fortress within a fortress, its multiple layers of walls and obstacles designed to channel attacking forces into carefully prepared killing zones. The wall's weapon emplacements included some of the most advanced defensive systems available to the Imperium, including experimental plasma cannons and graviton weapons that could tear apart attacking vehicles and aircraft with equal efficiency. Orbital weapon platforms represented another crucial element of Terra's defensive preparations. These massive installations, positioned at key points throughout the Sol system, were designed to engage enemy fleets before they could reach Terra's atmosphere. The platforms themselves were essentially space-borne fortresses, their hulls bristling with lance batteries and nova cannons capable of crippling even the largest battleships. The construction of these platforms had required the combined efforts of the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Imperial Navy, with entire Forge worlds dedicating their production capacity to the creation of these defensive installations. The integration of void shield technology throughout Terra's defenses represented a significant advancement in defensive capabilities. These energy barriers, originally developed for use on Imperial starships, were adapted for planetary defense on a scale never before attempted. The void shields were arranged in overlapping layers, creating multiple defensive barriers that would force attacking forces to concentrate their firepower on specific points, allowing the defenders to respond with concentrated counterfire. The power requirements for these installations were enormous, requiring the construction of dedicated plasma reactors and geothermal taps that drew energy from Terra's molten core. The mobilization of the Imperial Army proceeded with the same methodical precision that characterized all of Dorn's preparations. Entire regiments were recalled from campaigns throughout the galaxy, their transports arriving at Terra's spaceports in a constant stream of military traffic. The Praetorian Guard, Terra's elite military formation, was expanded to include veterans from dozens of different campaigns, their experience in conventional warfare providing a crucial complement to the superhuman capabilities of the Space Marines. These forces were organized into defensive sectors, each assigned to specific sections of the palace complex, and equipped with weapons and equipment appropriate to their expected role in the coming battle. The integration of civilian populations into the defensive structure represented one of the most challenging aspects of the preparation. Terra's population numbered in the hundreds of billions, concentrated in massive hive cities that stretched across entire continents. Rather than attempting to evacuate these populations, Dorn's planners recognized that they could serve as a valuable resource if properly organized and equipped. Civilian defense forces were established in each major population center, their members trained in basic combat techniques and equipped with lasguns and other infantry weapons. These forces were not expected to engage Space Marines in direct combat, but they could serve as scouts, saboteurs, and auxiliary troops in support of the main defensive effort. The Adeptus Mechanicus forces stationed on Terra played a crucial role in the fortification efforts. The Tech Priests of Mars had long maintained a significant presence on the throne world, their forges and laboratories producing some of the most advanced technology in the Imperium. These facilities were now converted to military production, their assembly lines churning out weapons, ammunition, and defensive equipment at an unprecedented rate. The Mechanicus forces themselves, including Skitarii legions and Titan maniples, were integrated into the defensive plans, their advanced weaponry and cybernetic enhancements making them particularly effective against the corrupted forces that served the War Master. The establishment of anti-orbital batteries throughout Terra's surface represented a massive undertaking that required the coordination of multiple Imperial agencies. These installations, ranging from relatively small laser batteries to massive macro cannons capable of engaging starships in orbit, were positioned to provide overlapping coverage of Terra's airspace. The batteries were connected by underground communication networks that allowed for coordinated fire control, ensuring that attacking aircraft and dropships would face concentrated defensive fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The integration of the palace's ancient archaeotech defenses with newer Imperial technology presented unique challenges for Dorn's engineers. The palace had been built upon the foundations of structures that predated the Age of Strife, their builders possessing knowledge and techniques that had been lost to the current age. Many of these ancient systems remained functional, their power sources and control mechanisms incomprehensible to even the most learned tech priests. Rather than attempting to understand these systems completely, Dorn's engineers focused on integrating them with newer defensive installations, creating hybrid systems that combine the reliability of Imperial technology with the mysterious power of archaeotech devices. The psychological preparation of Terra's defenders proved to be as important as the physical fortifications. The knowledge that they faced their own Gene brothers in combat weighed heavily on the Space Marines assigned to the defense, while the Imperial Army troops struggled to comprehend the scale of the betrayal that had torn the Imperium apart. Chaplains from the loyal legions worked tirelessly to maintain morale among the defenders, their sermons emphasizing the righteousness of their cause and the necessity of standing firm against the corruption that approached from the outer system. The Emperor's final instructions to his remaining loyal Primarchs were delivered in private audiences held deep within the palace's most secure chambers. These meetings, conducted in the shadow of the Golden Throne itself, represented the last direct communication between the Emperor and his sons before he was forced to dedicate his full attention to maintaining the barriers that held back the forces of chaos from the damaged webway. The Emperor's words to each Primarch were tailored to their individual strengths and weaknesses, providing guidance that would prove crucial in the battles to come. Rogal Dorn received detailed instructions regarding the conduct of the siege, including specific guidance on when and how to conduct tactical withdrawals that would draw the traitor forces deeper into prepared killing zones. The Emperor emphasized the importance of maintaining the integrity of the inner palace at all costs, making it clear that the defense of the Eternity Gate and the approaches to the throne room represented the absolute priority for the Imperial Fists and their allies. Sanguinius was provided with intelligence regarding the nature of the corruption that had taken hold among the traitor legions, including warnings about the demonic entities that now fought alongside the War Master's forces. The Emperor's instructions to the Angel included specific tactical recommendations for combating these supernatural threats, drawing upon knowledge that predated the Great Crusade and the founding of the Imperium itself. Jaghatai Khan received orders that emphasized the importance of maintaining mobility and flexibility in the face of the traitor assault. The Emperor recognized that the White Scar's traditional tactics would need to be adapted to the constraints of defensive warfare, but he also understood that their speed and agility could be crucial in responding to unexpected developments during the siege. The final preparations for Terra's defense extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the Imperial Palace. The planet's industrial capacity was mobilized to support the war effort, with factories and manufactorums across the globe converted to military production. The ancient forges of the Urals churned out ammunition and spare parts, while the shipyards of the Pacific produced small craft and atmospheric fighters that would be crucial in the coming battle. Even Terra's agricultural regions were pressed into service, their output redirected to feed the millions of defenders who would soon face the War Master's assault. The establishment of command and control networks throughout the defensive system represented a crucial element of the preparations. Communication arrays were hardened against electromagnetic interference and psychic attack, while backup systems were established to ensure that defensive coordination could continue even if primary communication networks were compromised. The command bunkers themselves were constructed to withstand direct hits from orbital bombardment, their walls lined with psychic dampening materials that would prevent enemy psychers from disrupting defensive operations. As the traitor fleet drew closer to the inner system, the final elements of Terra's defenses were put into place. The void shields were brought online, their energy barriers shimmering in the thin atmosphere above the palace's highest spires. The orbital weapons platforms reported ready status, their crews prepared to engage the enemy fleet as soon as it came within range. Throughout the palace complex and across Terra's surface, millions of defenders took their positions, their weapons loaded, and their resolve steeled for the battle that would determine the fate of humanity itself. The armada that translated into real space at the edge of the Sol system represented the largest concentration of military force ever assembled in human history. The War Master's fleet stretched across hundreds of thousands of kilometers of void, its constituent vessels ranging from massive battleships that had served as the backbone of the Great Crusade to hastily converted merchant haulers pressed into military service. At the heart of this vast formation sailed the vengeful spirit, Horus Lupercal's flagship, its hull bearing the scars of 7 years of continuous warfare and the unmistakable marks of chaos corruption that had transformed it from a symbol of imperial might into something altogether more sinister. The Sons of Horus formed the core of the invasion force, their fleet elements maintaining the disciplined formations that had made them the most feared legion during the Great Crusade. The War Master's own legion had been the first to embrace the gifts of the Chaos Gods, their gene seed gradually corrupting as the influence of the warp took hold. Their battle barges and strike cruisers bore fresh scars from the campaigns that had brought them to Terra's doorstep, their hulls adorned with trophies taken from loyalist vessels destroyed during the Long March to the Throne World. The Legion's tactical doctrine had evolved significantly since their fall, incorporating demonic allies and warp-spawned horrors that defied conventional military thinking. The World Eaters brought their own distinctive brand of savagery to the invasion fleet. Angron's legion had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all the traitor forces, their descent into mindless bloodlust, accelerated by the butcher's nails that had been implanted in their skulls. Their vessels showed clear signs of the Legion's deteriorating discipline, with hull modifications that served no tactical purpose beyond satisfying their hunger for violence. Boarding spikes and ram prows had been welded to ships never designed for such brutal modifications, while the internal spaces had been reconfigured to accommodate gladiatorial pits where the Astartes could indulge their need for constant combat. The Emperor's children represented the most visually striking element of the traitor fleet, their vessels bearing the elaborate decorations and artistic modifications that reflected their legion's obsession with perfection and excess. Fulgrim's warriors had embraced the patronage of Slaanesh with characteristic enthusiasm, their ships becoming floating galleries of depravity and sensory overload. The sonic weapons that had become their signature armament were integrated into their vessels' weapon systems, creating weapons platforms capable of devastating enemy formations through pure acoustic destruction. The Legion's pursuit of perfection had led them to experiment with ship designs that pushed the boundaries of both engineering and sanity. The Death Guard brought their own grim contribution to the invasion force, their vessels bearing the unmistakable marks of Nurgle's corruption. Mortarian's legion had embraced decay and entropy as tools of war, their ships becoming breeding grounds for plagues and diseases that could devastate entire worlds. The hulls of their vessels were pitted and corroded, their surfaces covered with growths and excrescences that spoke of the plague god's influence. The Legion's expertise in chemical warfare had been adapted for void combat, their ships equipped with specialized systems capable of deploying toxic clouds and corrosive agents that could eat through enemy armor and life support systems. The Iron Warriors provided the siege expertise that would prove crucial in the assault on Terra's defenses. Perdurabo's legion had always specialized in the reduction of fortified positions, their methodical approach to warfare making them invaluable for the systematic destruction of defensive installations. Their fleet included specialized siege vessels, equipped with massive bombardment cannons and void shield disruptors designed specifically for attacking planetary fortifications. The Legion's engineers had spent years developing new siege techniques and weapon systems, their bitter experience at the Iron Cage serving as motivation for their preparations to assault the Imperial Palace. The Dark Mechanicum forces that accompanied the traitor fleet represented a significant departure from the orthodox teachings of the Omnissiah. These tech priests had embraced the dark knowledge offered by the Chaos Gods, their forges producing weapons and war machines that incorporated demonic essence and warp-touch technology. Their vessels were hybrid constructions that combined traditional Imperial engineering with innovations that would have been considered heretical by their loyalist counterparts. Demon engines and possessed machines formed a significant portion of their ground forces, these constructs representing the fusion of flesh, metal, and demonic essence that characterized the Dark Mechanicum's approach to warfare. The Titan legions that marched with the War Master represented some of the most devastating weapons in the traitor arsenal. The Legio Mortis, the Death's Heads, had been among the first Titan legions to declare for Horus, their god machines bearing the colors of the War Master and the 8-pointed Star of Chaos. These massive war engines had been modified with demonic components and warp-touched weapon systems that enhanced their already formidable capabilities. The princeps who commanded these titans had undergone their own transformation, their minds touched by the influence of the warp and their connection to their machines deepened through rituals that would have been considered abhorrent by the loyalist Mechanicum. The Legio Vulpa, the Fire Wasps, brought their own specialized expertise to the invasion force. This Titan Legion had always favored close-range combat and urban warfare, their god machines equipped with flamers and melta-weapons, designed for the systematic destruction of fortified positions. The Legion's tactical doctrine emphasized the use of overwhelming firepower to break enemy morale, their Titans advancing in coordinated formations that could reduce entire city blocks to molten slag. The corruption of chaos had enhanced their destructive capabilities, their weapons now incorporating demonic fire that could burn through even the most advanced defensive systems. The Night Houses that had declared for the War Master added their own mobile firepower to the invasion force. These ancient warrior houses had been corrupted through a combination of political manipulation and direct exposure to chaos influence, their pilots gradually succumbing to the whispers of the dark gods. The Night Suits themselves had been modified with demonic components and warp-touched weapon systems, their machine spirits replaced with bound demons that enhanced their combat capabilities while slowly driving their pilots toward madness. The traditional codes of honor that had governed these houses for millennia had been twisted into dark parodies of their former selves. Horus's strategic planning for the assault on Terra demonstrated the tactical genius that had made him the Emperor's chosen War Master. The Primarch understood that a direct assault on the Imperial Palace would result in catastrophic casualties for his forces, regardless of their numerical superiority. Instead, he developed a multi-pronged strategy that would force the defenders to divide their attention and resources across multiple fronts simultaneously. The plan called for coordinated attacks on key strategic objectives that would systematically degrade Terra's defensive capabilities while drawing the Loyalist forces away from their prepared positions. The Lion's Gate spaceport represented the primary objective for the initial phase of the assault. This massive facility served as Terra's primary interface with orbital traffic. Its capture would allow the traitor forces to land their heaviest equipment and establish a secure beachhead on the planet's surface. The spaceport's defenses were formidable, but Horus recognized that its size and complexity made it vulnerable to the kind of coordinated assault that his forces could deliver. The capture of the spaceport would also provide symbolic value. demonstrating to the defenders that even Terra's most heavily fortified installations could fall to the War Master's forces. The assault on the palace walls themselves would require careful coordination between multiple Legion elements and their supporting forces. Horus planned to use the Iron Warrior's siege expertise to breach the outer defensive lines, while the World Eaters and Emperor's Children would exploit these breaches to establish footholds within the palace complex. The Death Guard would be responsible for securing the flanks of these assaults, their resistance to conventional weapons making them ideal for holding captured positions against loyalist counterattacks. The Sons of Horus would serve as the mobile reserve, ready to exploit any breakthrough that developed during the assault. The War Master's internal struggle with the corruption that had taken hold of his body and soul added a desperate urgency to his planning. The gifts of the Chaos Gods came with a price, and Horus could feel his humanity slipping away with each passing day. The visions that had originally driven him to rebellion now seemed distant and uncertain, replaced by the constant whispers of the dark gods and the growing influence of the warp upon his consciousness. His physical form had been transformed as well, his once noble features marked by the touch of chaos, and his strength enhanced by powers that came from beyond the material universe. The approach of loyalist reinforcements added another layer of complexity to the War Master's calculations. Intelligence reports indicated that Roboute Guilliman's Ultramarines were fighting their way through the galactic south, their fleet elements gradually overcoming the obstacles that had been placed in their path. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson remained unaccounted for, their whereabouts unknown, but their potential intervention a constant concern for the traitor High Command. Most significantly, reports suggested that Leman Russ and his Space Wolves were also moving toward Terra, their fleet having been detected in the outer reaches of the Segmentum Solar. The time factor that dominated all of Horus's strategic thinking stemmed from his understanding of the Emperor's current situation. The War Master knew that his father remained trapped upon the Golden Throne, his attention focused on maintaining the barriers that prevented the forces of chaos from pouring through the damaged webway. This presented a unique opportunity, but one that would not last indefinitely. If the Emperor could complete his work on the Webway project, or if sufficient loyalist reinforcements arrived to break the siege, the traitor cause would be lost. The assault on Terra had to succeed quickly and decisively before the strategic balance could shift in favor of the loyalists. The logistical challenges of maintaining such a massive invasion force in the Sol system required careful planning and coordination. The traitor fleet's supply lines stretched back across half the galaxy, their ships dependent on captured Imperial facilities and dark mechanicum forges for resupply and maintenance. The corruption of chaos had made some of these logistical concerns less pressing, as demonic allies required no conventional supplies and warp-touched weapons could function without traditional ammunition. However, the majority of the traitor forces still required food, fuel, and spare parts, making the establishment of secure supply lines a crucial element of the overall strategy. The integration of demonic forces into the invasion plans represented perhaps the most significant departure from conventional Imperial military doctrine. The entities that served the Chaos Gods operated according to their own alien logic, their motivations and capabilities often incomprehensible to mortal minds. Horus had learned to work with these forces through years of experience, but their presence added an element of unpredictability to his plans that conventional military thinking could not account for. The demon's ability to manifest in real space was limited by the strength of the warp in the local area, but their presence on Terra itself, with its concentration of psychic energy and emotional resonance, would make them far more powerful than they had been in previous campaigns. The psychological warfare aspects of the invasion were carefully planned to maximize their impact on the defenders' morale. The traitor forces had spent years perfecting techniques designed to break the will of their enemies before battle was even joined. The corruption of former loyalists and the display of captured Imperial symbols and banners served to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The presence of fallen Primarchs and corrupted Space Marines would have a particularly devastating effect on the loyalist Astartes, forcing them to confront the reality that their own Gene brothers had chosen damnation over duty. The naval component of the assault would require careful coordination between the various fleet elements to maximize their effectiveness against Terra's orbital defenses. The traitor fleet's numerical superiority would be offset by the defenders' advantages in terms of prepared positions and coordinated fire control. Horus planned to use feint attacks and diversionary maneuvers to draw the orbital defense platforms out of position, creating gaps in the defensive network that could be exploited by his assault forces. The fleet's heavy units would concentrate their fire on specific sections of the defensive grid, overwhelming the void shields and weapon systems through sheer volume of fire. The first phase of the Siege of Terra began not with the thunder of macro cannons or the roar of drop pods breaking atmosphere, but with the subtle dance of reconnaissance fleets probing the outer reaches of the Sol system. The traitor advance elements, comprised primarily of fast escort vessels and modified merchant raiders, had been operating in the system's periphery for weeks before the main fleet's arrival. These scouts mapped the defensive installations that ringed humanity's birth world, their augur arrays cataloging the positions of orbital weapons platforms and the patrol routes of loyalist naval squadrons. The Kuiper Belt installations were the first to fall silent. These remote monitoring stations, positioned at the very edge of the Sol system, had been designed to provide early warning of approaching fleets. Their crews, numbering in the hundreds of thousands across dozens of facilities, found themselves facing an enemy that defied conventional tactical doctrine. The attack patterns employed by the traitor scouts incorporated hit and run tactics that exploited the vast distances between installations, preventing the defenders from coordinating their response effectively. The station's void shields, designed to protect against asteroid impacts and solar radiation, proved inadequate against concentrated lance fire from multiple directions. The fall of monitoring station Xerxes 7 exemplified the systematic nature of the traitor advance. The facility, built into a captured asteroid and equipped with long-range Vox transmitters capable of reaching Terra directly, had detected the approach of 3 escort vessels bearing the colors of the Sons of Horus. The station commander, a veteran of the Great Crusade named Captain Mordian Vex, had attempted to transmit a warning to the inner system before the attackers could close to weapons range. The traitor vessels had responded by launching boarding torpedoes, while simultaneously engaging the station's defensive turrets with precision lance strikes. The boarding action that followed demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred within the traitor legions since their fall to chaos. The Sons of Horus assault teams moved through the station's corridors with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, their movements guided by intelligence that should have been impossible to obtain. The defenders found themselves facing Astartes, whose tactical awareness had been enhanced by the gifts of the Dark Gods, their ability to predict enemy movements and exploit weaknesses elevated beyond normal human comprehension. The station's internal defenses, including automated turret systems and blast doors designed to compartmentalize the facility, were systematically bypassed or destroyed. The corruption of the station's machine spirits represented a new and terrifying development in the traitor arsenal. Dark Mechanicum adepts accompanying the boarding parties employed techniques that violated the fundamental principles of the Omnissiah's teachings, their rituals binding demon essence to the facility's cogitator systems. The possessed machines turned against their former masters, blast doors sealing loyalist defenders into sections that were then vented to space, while automated systems began broadcasting false all-clear signals to other installations in the network. Mars presented a far more complex challenge for the traitor forces than the isolated monitoring stations of the outer system. The Red Planet had been the heart of the Mechanicum since the earliest days of the Great Crusade, its forges producing the weapons and war machines that had enabled humanity's expansion across the galaxy. The civil war that had erupted within the Mechanicum itself had turned Mars into a battlefield where ancient allies fought with weapons that pushed the boundaries of human understanding. The fabricator General Kelber, Hal's declaration for the War Master, had split the Mechanicum down the middle, with roughly half of the tech priests and their associated forces remaining loyal to the Emperor, while the others embraced the dark knowledge offered by the Chaos Gods. the loyalist forces, led by figures such as Fabricator Locum Kane and supported by elements of the Legio Tempestus Titan Legion, had established defensive positions around the most critical forge complexes. Their opponents, now calling themselves the Dark Mechanicum, had begun implementing modifications to their war machines that incorporated demonic essence and warp touch technology. The first major engagement on Mars occurred at the Olympus Mons Forge complex, where the loyalist forces had concentrated their heaviest industrial capacity. The attacking Dark Mechanicum forces employed a combination of conventional siege tactics and heretical innovations that caught the defenders off guard. Demon engines, their metal shells housing bound entities from the warp, advanced through the complex's outer defenses with an unpredictability that made them nearly impossible to target effectively. These constructs moved with a fluid grace that defied their mechanical nature, their weapons systems incorporating technologies that should not have been possible within the constraints of real space physics. The Skitarii legions that fought on both sides of the conflict demonstrated the fundamental philosophical divide that had torn the Mechanicum apart. The loyalist forces maintained their traditional doctrine of precise, coordinated advances supported by overwhelming firepower from their heavy weapons teams. Their opponents had abandoned such constraints, their movements guided by the whispers of machine spirits that had been corrupted by exposure to the warp. The Dark Mechanicum Skitarii advanced in formations that seemed chaotic to outside observers, but followed patterns that reflected the alien logic of their demonic allies. The Titan combat that erupted across Mars's surface represented warfare on a scale that dwarfed even the massive battles of the Great Crusade. The god machines of the Legio Tempestus found themselves facing opponents whose capabilities had been enhanced by modifications that violated every principle of the Omnissiah's teachings. The corrupted titans of the Legio Mortis moved with an agility that their original designs had never possessed, their reactor cores burning with fires that drew power from the warp itself. The weapons they carried incorporated demonic essence that allowed them to punch through void shields and armor plating with an efficiency that defied conventional understanding. The psychological impact of these battles on the loyalist defenders cannot be overstated. The tech priests of Mars had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of knowledge and the perfection of the machine, their faith in the Omnissiah serving as the foundation for their entire worldview. To see their former colleagues embrace technologies that incorporated demonic corruption represented a fundamental challenge to everything they believed. The machine spirits that had been their constant companions for decades or centuries began to whisper of forbidden knowledge and dark gifts, forcing the loyalists to question the very nature of their relationship with the machines they served. The orbital installations that protected the inner system presented the traitor forces with their first taste of the defensive preparations that Rogal Dorn had implemented throughout the Sol system. These weapons platforms, ranging from converted asteroids to purpose-built fortress stations, had been positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire that would force attacking fleets to run a gauntlet of defensive fire before they could reach Terra's atmosphere. The platforms themselves were marvels of Imperial engineering, their hulls constructed from adamantium and ceramite composites that could withstand direct hits from battleship-class weapons. The assault on defense platform Sigma-12 demonstrated the tactical innovations that the traitor forces had developed during their long march to Terra. The platform, positioned at the edge of the asteroid belt and equipped with Nova cannon batteries capable of engaging targets at extreme range, had been designed to operate independently for extended periods. Its crew of 50,000 included naval armsmen, Mechanicum tech priests, and a small garrison of Imperial fists who served as the platform's primary defensive force. The attack began with a coordinated strike by multiple squadrons of Thunderhawk gunships launched from the traitor fleet's carriers. These assault craft had been modified with additional armor plating and void shields, allowing them to survive the initial defensive fire as they closed with the platform. The gunship's assault cannons and las cannons targeted the platform's point defense systems, systematically destroying the automated turrets and missile launchers that formed the installation's close-range defensive network. The boarding action that followed showcased the tactical evolution that had occurred within the traitor legions since their fall to chaos. The assault teams moved through the platform's corridors with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, their movements guided by intelligence that should have been impossible to obtain. The defenders found themselves facing Astartes, whose combat abilities had been enhanced by the gifts of the Dark Gods, their strength and speed elevated beyond the already superhuman capabilities of the Space Marines. The corruption of the platform systems proceeded with a methodical precision that spoke to the Dark Mechanicum's growing expertise in the subversion of Imperial technology. Tech priests accompanying the boarding parties employed rituals that bound demon essence to the facility's machine spirits, turning the platform's own systems against its defenders. Blast doors sealed loyalist forces into sections that were then vented to space, while the platform's weapon systems began targeting nearby loyalist installations instead of the attacking traitor forces. The Luna defensive network represented the final major obstacle between the traitor fleet and Terra itself. The ancient satellite had been transformed into a fortress moon, its surface covered with weapons emplacements, and its underground cities serving as staging areas for the system's mobile reserves. The Selenar gene cults that had ruled Luna before the Emperor's conquest had been replaced by Imperial administrators, but the moon's industrial capacity had been expanded to support the war effort. The first probing attacks against Luna's defenses revealed the extent of the preparations that had been made for the system's defense. The moon's surface was protected by overlapping void shield generators that created multiple layers of defensive barriers, while its weapons emplacements included some of the most advanced systems available to the Imperium. The defenders had learned from the fall of the outer system installations, implementing new tactical doctrines that emphasized rapid response and coordinated fire control. The traitor forces' response to these defenses demonstrated the tactical flexibility that had made Horus Lupercal the Emperor's chosen warmaster. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Luna's most heavily defended positions, the traitor fleet concentrated its efforts on the moon's polar regions, where the defensive coverage was less comprehensive. The attack employed a combination of orbital bombardment and ground assault that forced the defenders to divide their attention between multiple threats simultaneously. The deployment of chaos corrupted war machines during these initial engagements marked a significant escalation in the conflict's intensity. The demon engines that accompanied the traitor ground forces operated according to principles that defied conventional military logic, their movements guided by the alien intelligence of the entities bound within their metal shells. These constructs advanced through defensive fire that should have destroyed conventional vehicles, their demonic essence allowing them to survive damage that would have crippled normal war machines. The psychological impact of these manifestations on the Imperial defenders was immediate and devastating. The soldiers of the Imperial army had been trained to fight human enemies using conventional weapons and tactics, but the sight of demon engines advancing through their defensive fire while wreathed in unnatural flames challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare. The creatures that emerged from these machines when they were finally destroyed defied description, their forms shifting and changing as they moved through real space in ways that violated the basic laws of physics. The first confirmed sighting of a greater demon on Luna sent shockwaves through the loyalist command structure. The entity, identified as a bloodthirster of Khorne, had manifested during the assault on defensive complex Gamma 7, its presence announced by the spontaneous combustion of the facility's atmospheric processors. The demon's physical form towered above even the Astartes who fought to contain it, its brass armor reflecting the flames that surrounded its massive frame. The creature's weapons, a whip of living flame and an axe forged from the screams of the damned, carved through the defenders' ranks with an efficiency that spoke to millennia of experience in warfare. The loyalist response to this manifestation revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of their defensive preparations. The Imperial Fist's garrison assigned to the complex had been trained to fight conventional enemies, their tactics emphasizing disciplined firepower and coordinated advances. Against an opponent that could ignore physical laws and whose very presence weakened the barriers between real space and the warp, these conventional tactics proved inadequate. The demon's ability to teleport across the battlefield and its resistance to conventional weapons forced the defenders to adapt their tactics in real time, a process that cost them dearly in both time and casualties. The evacuation of civilian populations from the outer system installations proceeded with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all Imperial military operations, but the scale of the undertaking strained the available transport capacity to its limits. Refugee ships streamed toward Terra's inner system, their holds packed with civilians fleeing the advancing tide of corruption. The sight of these vessels, many showing battle damage from their escape through contested space, served as a constant reminder to the defenders of what was at stake in the coming battle. The intelligence gathered during these initial engagements provided the Loyalist command with their first comprehensive assessment of the traitor force's capabilities and intentions. The systematic nature of the attacks, combined with the tactical innovations that the enemy had displayed, made it clear that this would not be a conventional siege. The corruption of Imperial technology and the deployment of demonic allies represented challenges that the defenders had not fully anticipated, forcing them to revise their defensive plans and tactical doctrines in response to the evolving threat. The loss of the outer system's early warning network left Terra's defenders effectively blind to the traitor fleet's movements beyond the asteroid belt. The communication relays that had provided real-time intelligence about enemy positions and movements had been systematically destroyed or corrupted, forcing the Loyalists to rely on patrol ships and reconnaissance flights for tactical intelligence. This information blackout would prove to be one of the most significant advantages that the traitor forces gained during the opening phases of the siege. The orbital bombardment preceded the traitor landings, announced by the sudden flare of plasma drives as the War Master's fleet moved into bombardment positions above Terra's atmosphere. The assault opened with a coordinated strike from over 200 battleships and heavy cruisers, their macro cannon batteries and lance arrays targeting the orbital defense platforms that formed the first line of resistance. The void shields protecting these installations flared brilliant white as they absorbed the incoming fire, their energy matrices straining under the sustained assault from weapons designed to crack open the hulls of starships. The bombardment strategy employed by Horus demonstrated the tactical acumen that had made him the Emperor's chosen War Master. Rather than attempting to obliterate Terra's defenses through brute force, the traitor fleet concentrated their fire on specific nodes within the defensive network. The targeting priorities had been carefully calculated to maximize the disruption of the Loyalist response while preserving the infrastructure that would be needed for the occupation of Terra. The primary spaceports, industrial complexes, and communication hubs received precision strikes designed to disable rather than destroy, while the outer defensive walls absorbed the full fury of the fleet's heaviest weapons. The Lion's Gate spaceport became the focal point of the initial bombardment as the traitor forces sought to establish their primary beachhead on Terra's surface. This massive facility, stretching across hundreds of square kilometers of the Himalayan plateau, served as the primary interface between Terra's surface and the orbital traffic that sustained the throne world's population. The spaceport's defensive systems included void shield generators powerful enough to protect against orbital bombardment, but the sustained fire from multiple battleships gradually overloaded these barriers. The first void shield failure occurred at the spaceport's northern terminal complex, where a concentrated barrage from the sons of Horus battle barge Warmaster's pride finally overwhelmed the energy matrix. The macro cannon rounds that followed carved deep craters in the Ferrocrete landing platforms, sending massive chunks of debris spinning through the thin atmosphere. The destruction was precisely controlled, targeting the defensive installations and anti-aircraft batteries, while leaving the landing platforms themselves largely intact. The Loyalist response to the orbital bombardment revealed both the strengths and limitations of Terra's defensive preparations. The planetary defense batteries, positioned throughout the Himalayan ranges, opened fire on the traitor fleet, their massive guns hurling shells the size of Hab blocks into the void. The orbital weapons platforms that had survived the initial assault added their firepower to the defensive barrage, their Nova cannons and lance batteries reaching out to engage the enemy vessels at extreme range. The coordinated fire from these installations managed to cripple several traitor escorts and force the heavier ships to maintain greater distances from the planet's surface. The Iron Warriors' expertise in siege warfare became evident as their fleet elements began systematic suppression of Terra's ground-based defenses. The 4th Legion's ships carried specialized bombardment arrays designed specifically for the reduction of fortified positions, their weapons incorporating targeting systems that could identify and prioritize defensive installations with mechanical precision. The bombardment patterns they employed followed mathematical principles that maximized the disruption of defensive fire while minimizing the exposure of their own vessels to return fire. The atmospheric entry of the first wave of assault craft began while the orbital bombardment was still in progress, the traitor forces exploiting the gaps in the defensive network created by their fleet's concentrated fire. The assault transports descended through Terra's atmosphere in formations that had been carefully planned to overwhelm the remaining anti-aircraft defenses through sheer numbers. Thunderhawk gunships and Storm Eagles provided escort for the larger transports, their weapons systems engaging the automated defense turrets that tracked the incoming formations. The Lion's Gate spaceport's final defensive line consisted of surface-to-air missile batteries and rapid-fire autocannon arrays positioned around the facility's perimeter. These weapon systems had been designed to engage conventional aircraft and orbital transports, but the traitor assault craft incorporated modifications that challenged their targeting systems. Void shields mounted on the larger transports deflected incoming missiles, while chaff dispensers and electronic countermeasures disrupted the fire control systems of the defensive installations. The first traitor forces to reach Terra's surface were advanced reconnaissance teams from the Sons of Horus, their modified Thunderhawks touching down in the contested zones around the spaceport's outer perimeter. These initial landings were conducted under heavy fire from the loyalist defenders, with several assault craft destroyed by concentrated fire from the remaining defensive positions. The Astartes who emerged from the surviving transports moved with the practiced efficiency of veterans, their power armor scarred by 7 years of continuous warfare and bearing the 8-pointed star of chaos. The tactical evolution that had occurred within the traitor legions since their fall became immediately apparent as these advance elements engaged the Imperial Army defenders manning the spaceport's outer defenses. The Sons of Horus assault teams moved through the defensive positions with a coordination that seemed almost supernatural, their tactical awareness enhanced by the gifts of the dark gods. The corruption that had taken hold within their ranks manifested in subtle ways that gave them advantages over their loyalist opponents, their reflexes quickened by exposure to the warp, and their combat instincts sharpened by years of fighting alongside demonic allies. The Imperial Army regiments defending the spaceport had been drawn from some of the finest formations in the Imperium, their ranks including veterans of the Great Crusade who had fought alongside the Space Marines on dozens of worlds. The Lucifer Blacks, Terra's elite guard regiment, had been reinforced with heavy weapons teams and armored support specifically to counter the expected assault. Their lasguns and heavy bolters opened fire on the advancing traitors, the disciplined volleys creating overlapping fields of fire that should have stopped any conventional assault. The reality of fighting corrupted Astartes proved far more challenging than the defenders had anticipated. The traitor Space Marines advanced through defensive fire that would have decimated normal troops, their power armor absorbing hits that would have been fatal to unaugmented humans. The corruption that had taken hold within their ranks manifested in ways that defied conventional military logic, with some warriors shrugging off wounds that should have incapacitated them, while others moved with an inhuman speed that made them nearly impossible to target effectively. The deployment of super heavy war machines marked the beginning of the second phase of the traitor assault. The massive transport craft that had been holding position in Terra's upper atmosphere began their descent, their hulls containing the heaviest equipment that the War Master's forces could bring to bear. The sight of these transports, each one the size of a small starship, descending through the smoke and flames of the ongoing bombardment, served as a stark reminder of the scale of the invasion force. The first warlord titan to make planetfall was the Conqueror of Istvan, a god machine of the Legio Mortis that had earned its name during the drop site massacre. The massive war engine emerged from its transport with the mechanical precision that characterized all Titan operations, its void shields flickering to life as it took its first steps on Terra's surface. The Titan's weapon systems, including a pair of turbo laser destructors and a volcano cannon capable of reducing buildings to molten slag, began targeting the spaceport's remaining defensive positions with methodical precision. The loyalist response to the Titan's deployment revealed the extent of the preparations that had been made for the defense of Terra. Hidden weapons emplacements throughout the spaceport complex opened fire on the war engine, their heavy las cannons and missile launchers targeting the joints and weapon systems that represented the Titan's most vulnerable points. The coordinated fire from these positions managed to overload sections of the Titan's void shields, but the war engine's thick armor plating absorbed the follow-up shots with minimal damage. The Baneblade Super heavy tanks that accompanied the Titan deployment represented the pinnacle of Imperial armored warfare technology. These massive vehicles, each one weighing over 300 tons and mounting enough firepower to level city blocks, had been modified with additional armor plating and upgraded weapon systems. The traitor Baneblades bore the colors of the Iron Warriors, their hulls painted in the hazard stripes that marked them as siege specialists. The tank's multiple weapon systems engaged targets throughout the spaceport complex, their battle cannons and las cannons systematically destroying defensive positions, while their secondary weapons swept the approaches clear of infantry. The ground engagement that developed around the spaceport's main terminal building showcased the tactical innovations that both sides had developed during the heresy. The loyalist defenders had prepared the facility for siege warfare, with barricades and firing positions constructed throughout the complex's interior spaces. The Imperial Fist's garrison assigned to the spaceport's defense had spent months preparing these positions, their expertise in defensive warfare evident in the overlapping fields of fire and carefully planned fallback positions they had established. The traitor assault on these positions demonstrated the evolution of Space Marine tactics that had occurred since the beginning of the heresy. The attacking forces employed a combination of conventional assault techniques and innovations that incorporated the gifts of the Dark Gods. Possessed Marines led the advance, their enhanced strength and resilience allowing them to breach defensive positions that would have stopped normal Astartes. The corruption that had taken hold within their ranks manifested in ways that gave them tactical advantages, with some warriors able to phase through solid matter, while others moved with an inhuman speed that made them nearly impossible to target. The deployment of demon engines during the assault marked a significant escalation in the conflict's supernatural elements. These war machines, their metal shells housing bound entities from the warp, advanced through the spaceport's defensive positions with an unpredictability that made conventional anti-armor tactics ineffective. The defilers and soul grinders that accompanied the traitor ground forces operated according to principles that defied conventional military logic, their movements guided by the alien intelligence of the demons bound within their mechanical forms. The Mechanicum forces that participated in the assault brought their own specialized equipment to bear against the spaceport's defenses. The Dark Mechanicum tech priests who had declared for the War Master deployed war machines that incorporated technologies forbidden by orthodox imperial doctrine. Their Ordinatus siege engines, massive artillery pieces designed for the reduction of fortified positions, began systematic bombardment of the spaceport's most heavily defended areas. The weapons they employed incorporated daemonic essence that allowed them to punch through defensive barriers with an efficiency that conventional artillery could not match. The first major breakthrough in the loyalist defensive lines occurred at the spaceport's eastern perimeter, where a concentrated assault by World Eater's assault marines overwhelmed the defenders through sheer savagery. The 12th Legion's warriors had been transformed by their exposure to the butcher's nails and the corruption of corn, their tactical discipline replaced by an unstoppable hunger for violence. The assault they launched against the defensive positions defied conventional military logic, with individual Marines charging through defensive fire that should have been fatal, while their battle brothers followed in their wake. The psychological impact of the World Eater's assault on the Imperial Army defenders cannot be overstated. The soldiers who faced these corrupted Astartes found themselves confronting enemies who seemed to feel no pain and showed no fear, their advance continuing even when they had sustained wounds that would have incapacitated normal humans. The sight of Space Marines, the Emperor's finest warriors, transformed into blood-mad berserkers, challenged the fundamental beliefs of the loyalist forces and forced them to confront the reality of what their former allies had become. The establishment of the first secure beachhead on Terra's surface occurred when the traitor forces successfully captured the spaceport's main landing platform. This massive structure, capable of accommodating multiple starships simultaneously, provided the traitors with the infrastructure they needed to begin landing their heaviest equipment. The platform's capture allowed the deployment of additional Titan manifolds and super heavy tank companies, their arrival shifting the tactical balance in favor of the attacking forces. The loyalist counterattack that followed demonstrated the tactical flexibility that Rogal Dorn had built into Terra's defensive plans. Imperial Fist's strike teams launched coordinated assaults on the traitor positions from multiple directions, their attacks designed to disrupt the enemy's consolidation of their gains. The counterattacks employed a combination of conventional tactics and innovations that had been developed specifically for fighting corrupted Astartes, including specialized ammunition and weapon systems designed to counter the supernatural abilities that the traitors had gained. The urban combat that developed throughout the spaceport complex represented a new form of warfare that neither side had fully anticipated. The facility's interior spaces, designed for the efficient movement of cargo and passengers, became killing grounds where individual squads of Space Marines fought desperate battles for control of strategic positions. The close-quarters nature of the fighting negated many of the advantages that the traitor forces' heavy weapons provided, while the loyalist defenders' knowledge of the facility's layout allowed them to conduct ambushes and flanking maneuvers that inflicted significant casualties on the attackers. The deployment of specialized siege equipment by the Iron Warriors marked the beginning of the systematic reduction of the spaceport's remaining defensive positions. The 4th Legion's engineers brought their expertise in fortress warfare to bear against the loyalist strongholds, their siege drills and demolition charges opening breaches in walls that had been designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The methodical approach that characterized all Iron Warriors' operations became evident as they systematically dismantled the defensive positions that had been carefully prepared by the Imperial Fists. The corruption of the spaceport's machine spirits represented a new and terrifying development in the traitor arsenal. Dark Mechanicum adepts accompanying the assault forces employed techniques that violated the fundamental principles of the Omnissiah's teachings, their rituals binding demon essence to the facility's control systems. The possessed machines turned against their former masters, blast doors sealing loyalist defenders into sections that were then vented to the void, while automated systems began broadcasting false status reports to the planetary defense network. The systematic dismantling of Terra's outer defensive rings began with the methodical precision that had made the Iron Warriors the most feared siege specialists in the galaxy. Perdurabo's 4th Legion had spent decades perfecting the art of fortress reduction, their expertise honed through countless campaigns where they had been tasked with breaking seemingly impregnable defenses. The outer walls of the Imperial Palace, massive fortifications that stretched for hundreds of kilometers across the Himalayan plateau, represented the ultimate test of their siegecraft. The Iron Warriors' approach to the assault demonstrated the mathematical precision that characterized all their operations. Their engineers had spent months analyzing the defensive structures through long-range auger scans and intelligence gathered from captured loyalist personnel. Every gun emplacement, every void shield generator, every structural weakness had been cataloged and incorporated into their siege plans. The 4th Legion's Warsmith commanders deployed their forces with the mechanical efficiency of a well-oiled machine, each unit assigned specific objectives that would contribute to the systematic degradation of the palace's defenses. The siege artillery that the Iron Warriors brought to bear against the outer walls represented the pinnacle of their destructive capabilities. Massive basilisk artillery pieces, their barrels extended to accommodate specialized siege shells, began a coordinated bombardment that targeted the structural weak points identified by their reconnaissance teams. The shells they fired were not conventional high-explosive rounds, but specialized penetrator warheads designed to exploit the microscopic flaws in the palace's adamantium and ceramite construction. Each impact sent shockwaves through the massive walls, the cumulative effect gradually weakening the structural integrity of the fortifications. The Vindicator siege tanks that accompanied the artillery bombardment provided direct fire support against the palace's defensive positions. These heavily armored vehicles, their demolisher cannons capable of reducing buildings to rubble with single shots, advanced through the outer defensive zones with the inexorable pace that characterized all Iron Warriors' operations. The tanks' thick frontal armor allowed them to absorb return fire from the palace's defensive batteries, while their weapons systematically destroyed the gun positions and observation posts that coordinated the loyalist response. The Iron Warriors' expertise in siege warfare extended beyond mere firepower to encompass the psychological aspects of fortress reduction. Their bombardment patterns were designed to maximize the stress on the defending forces, with periods of intense shelling followed by ominous silences that kept the loyalists in a constant state of tension. The 4th Legion's understanding of defensive psychology allowed them to target specific positions, at times calculated to cause maximum disruption to the defenders' rest cycles and supply operations. The deployment of specialized siege equipment demonstrated the Iron Warriors' commitment to their craft. Massive siege drills, their adamantium-tipped boring heads capable of penetrating even the thickest armor plating, began systematic excavation of the outer wall's foundations. These machines, each one the size of a small building, operated with the relentless efficiency of industrial equipment, their progress measured in meters of solid rock and metal consumed per hour. The vibrations from their operation could be felt throughout the palace complex, a constant reminder to the defenders of the methodical destruction of their fortifications. The Iron Warriors' tactical doctrine emphasized the importance of combined arms operations in siege warfare. Their infantry squads advanced behind the cover of their siege engines, their bolters and heavy weapons providing suppressing fire against the palace's defensive positions. The 4th Legion's Astartes had been trained to operate in the confined spaces and rubble-strewn terrain that characterized siege warfare, their movements coordinated to exploit the breaches created by their heavy weapons. The squads carried specialized equipment for urban combat, including melta-bombs and breaching charges designed to clear defensive obstacles. The World Eater's contribution to the assault represented a stark contrast to the Iron Warriors' methodical approach. The 12th Legion's warriors had been transformed by their exposure to the butcher's nails and the corruption of corn, their tactical discipline replaced by an unstoppable hunger for violence. Their assault on the palace's outer defenses defied conventional military logic, with individual Marines charging through defensive fire that should have been fatal while their battle brothers followed in their wake. The psychological warfare employed by the corn-corrupted forces went beyond mere intimidation to encompass supernatural terror that challenged the sanity of the defending forces. The World Eater's battle cries, amplified by vox casters and echoing off the palace walls, carried with them the psychic resonance of their patron deity's rage. The sound of their chain axes revving and the wet impact of their weapons against flesh created an auditory assault that undermined the morale of even veteran Imperial Army troops. The berserker charges that characterized the World Eater's assault tactics created gaps in the palace's defensive lines that other traitor forces could exploit. The 12th Legion's warriors would surge forward in frenzied waves, their advance continuing even when they had sustained wounds that would have incapacitated normal humans. The sight of Space Marines, the Emperor's finest warriors, transformed into blood-mad berserkers, challenged the fundamental beliefs of the loyalist forces and created psychological trauma that persisted long after the immediate threat had passed. The World Eaters' tactical evolution, since their fall to chaos, had resulted in assault formations that maximized their natural aggression while minimizing their tactical weaknesses. Their assault squads had been reorganized into kill teams that specialized in close-quarters combat, their weapons loadouts emphasizing chain axes and bolt pistols over the more defensive equipment favored by other legions. The squads operated with a pack mentality that allowed them to coordinate their attacks despite their individual madness, their movements guided by an instinctive understanding of violence that transcended conventional military training. The deployment of Khorne berserkers during the assault marked a significant escalation in the supernatural elements of the siege. These warriors had undergone complete transformation through their exposure to the blood god's influence, their humanity subsumed by an endless hunger for violence. The berserkers advanced through defensive fire that would have stopped conventional troops, their power armor modified with additional close combat weapons, and their helmets replaced with skull-faced masks that reflected their dedication to Khorne. The World Eaters' assault on the Triumphal Gate, one of the Outer Palace's major entrances, demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of their corrupted tactics. The massive portal, constructed from adamantium and protected by void shields, had been designed to withstand orbital bombardment. The World Eaters' approach to breaching this obstacle involved sustained close-quarters assault that gradually overwhelmed the defensive positions through sheer attrition. Their casualties were enormous, but the 12th Legion's warriors seemed to draw strength from the blood of their fallen comrades, their attacks becoming more frenzied as the battle progressed. The Emperor's children brought their own distinctive approach to the assault on the palace's outer defenses. The 3rd Legion's pursuit of perfection had been corrupted by their exposure to Slaanesh, transforming their quest for excellence into an obsession with excess and sensory overload. Their assault on the civilian populations within the outer defensive zones represented a deliberate strategy designed to break the morale of the defending forces through the systematic terrorization of non-combatants. The sonic weapons that had become the Emperor's children's signature armament were employed with devastating effect against both military and civilian targets. The Noise Marines who spearheaded these attacks carried weapons that generated acoustic frequencies capable of liquefying human tissue and shattering reinforced structures. The sound of their weapons created a distinctive shriek that could be heard across the battlefield, a psychic assault that undermined the courage of even veteran troops. The Emperor's children's targeted strikes against civilian populations followed a calculated pattern designed to maximize psychological impact on the defending forces. Their assault squads would identify population centers within the outer defensive zones and conduct raids that emphasized brutality and excess over military efficiency. The survivors of these attacks were often left alive deliberately, their traumatic experiences serving to spread fear and despair among the broader civilian population. The 3rd Legion's tactical doctrine had evolved to incorporate the sensory overload that characterized their patron deity's influence. Their assault formations employed a combination of conventional weapons and sonic devices that created a multi-layered attack on the defender's senses. The visual spectacle of their advance, with power armor decorated in garish colors and excessive ornamentation, combined with the auditory assault of their weapons to create a psychological impact that went beyond mere intimidation. The Noise Marines' deployment of specialized sonic weapons against the palace's defensive structures demonstrated the Emperor's children's technical innovation in service of their corruption. The weapons they employed could generate specific frequencies that exploited the resonant properties of different materials, allowing them to bring down walls and fortifications through acoustic destruction rather than conventional explosives. The sight of massive stone blocks crumbling under the assault of pure sound challenged the defenders' understanding of physics and warfare. The Emperor's children's assault on the Scholars' Quarter, a civilian district within the outer defensive zone, exemplified their approach to psychological warfare. The 3rd Legion's warriors moved through the area with the methodical precision that had once characterized their pursuit of perfection, but their objectives had been corrupted by their exposure to Slaanesh. The population centers they targeted were chosen for their symbolic value rather than their military significance, their destruction designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance to the remaining defenders. The coordinated nature of the assault on the outer defenses revealed the strategic genius that had made Horus Lupercal the Emperor's chosen warmaster. The different approaches employed by each traitor legion complemented each other in ways that maximized their collective effectiveness. The Iron Warriors' methodical reduction of the fortifications created opportunities that the World Eaters could exploit through their frenzied assaults, while the Emperor's Children's psychological warfare undermined the morale of the defenders across the entire front. The Loyalist response to the multi-pronged assault demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the defensive preparations that had been made for the siege. The Imperial Fist's garrison assigned to the outer defenses had been trained to fight conventional enemies using established tactical doctrines, but the corrupted nature of their opponents required adaptations that challenged their fundamental understanding of warfare. The sight of former battle brothers transformed into demon-touched monsters forced the loyalist Astartes to confront the reality of what the heresy had wrought. The defensive positions that had been prepared throughout the outer palace complex were designed to channel attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where they could be destroyed by concentrated firepower. The overlapping fields of fire from concealed weapon emplacements and the carefully positioned obstacles that forced the attackers into specific approaches had been calculated to maximize casualties among conventional assault forces. The supernatural abilities that many of the traitor forces had gained through their corruption, however, allowed them to bypass or overcome these obstacles in ways that the defenders had not anticipated. The ammunition expenditure during the initial phases of the assault reached levels that strained the palace's supply networks to their limits. The defenders' heavy weapons teams fired continuously for hours at a time, their barrels glowing red-hot from the sustained rate of fire. The logistics personnel responsible for maintaining the ammunition supply worked under constant threat of enemy fire, their convoys targeted by traitor infiltration teams, and their supply depots subjected to artillery bombardment. The medical facilities within the outer defensive zones were overwhelmed by the casualties resulting from the assault. The injuries sustained by the defending forces reflected the diverse nature of the threats they faced, from conventional ballistic trauma to the exotic wounds inflicted by sonic weapons and demon-touched blades. The medical personnel struggled to treat conditions that defied conventional understanding, their training inadequate for dealing with the supernatural corruption that affected some of the wounded. The communication networks that coordinated the defense of the outer palace began to show signs of strain as the assault intensified. The Vox networks that connected the various defensive positions were subjected to jamming and interference from the traitor forces, while the command bunkers that served as coordination centers became priority targets for enemy artillery. The breakdown in communication coordination forced individual defensive positions to operate independently, reducing the effectiveness of the overall defensive effort. The first major breach in the outer defensive lines occurred at the interior Barbican, where a concentrated assault by multiple traitor legions overwhelmed the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The massive gatehouse, constructed from adamantium and ceramic composites, had been designed to withstand direct hits from Titan-class weapons. The combined assault by Iron Warriors' siege engines, World Eaters' berserkers, and Emperor's children's sonic weapons created a synergistic effect that exceeded the structure's design parameters. The collapse of the interior Barbican's main gate sent shockwaves through the Loyalist command structure, both literally and figuratively. The massive portal, weighing thousands of tons, fell inward with a thunderous crash that could be heard throughout the palace complex. The psychological impact of seeing such a massive fortification reduced to rubble in a matter of hours demonstrated to the defenders the scale of the threat they faced and the determination of their enemies to breach the palace's defenses. The breach of the interior barbican marked the beginning of a new phase in the siege, one where individual acts of heroism and monstrous corruption would define the character of the conflict. As traitor forces poured through the gaps in the outer defenses, the nature of the fighting transformed from methodical siege warfare to desperate close-quarters combat, where the superhuman abilities of the Space Marines were tested against opponents who had transcended the limitations of mere mortality through their embrace of chaos. Sigismund of the Imperial Fists emerged as the embodiment of loyalist resistance during these desperate hours. The first captain had spent the months before the siege in preparation that went beyond mere tactical planning, his meditations in the Temple of Oaths transforming him into something approaching a living weapon. The Emperor's champion, as he had come to be known, carried the Black Sword, an ancient relic whose origins predated the Great Crusade, and whose blade had been consecrated through rituals that bound it to the very essence of the imperial truth. The first of Sigismund's legendary duels occurred at the ruins of the interior barbican itself, where Kharn the Betrayer had led a World Eater's assault through the breach. The captain of the 8th Assault Company had been transformed by his exposure to the butcher's nails and the corruption of Khorne, his tactical acumen replaced by an unstoppable hunger for violence. The two warriors met in single combat amid the rubble of the collapsed gate, their battle serving as a microcosm of the larger conflict that raged around them. The duel between Sigismund and Kharn represented a clash between two fundamentally different philosophies of warfare. The Imperial Fist's champion fought with the disciplined precision that characterized his legion, each sword stroke calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure to counterattack. His opponent moved with the frenzied aggression of a berserker, his chain axe Gorchald carving through the air in patterns that seemed chaotic, but followed the alien logic of Khorne's influence. The combat lasted for over an hour, each warrior testing the other's skills and endurance in a display of martial prowess that drew the attention of combatants from both sides. Sigismund's victory came through the application of techniques that had been perfected through decades of training in the sword schools of Terra. The Black Sword's ancient blade parried Gorchald's final strike and continued in a fluid motion that opened Kharn's throat, the World Eater's enhanced physiology unable to compensate for the precise placement of the wound. The sight of the feared betrayer falling to the Imperial Fist's champion sent shockwaves through the traitor assault forces and provided a crucial morale boost to the beleaguered defenders. The second major duel that established Sigismund's reputation occurred during the assault on the Colossi Gate, where Lucius the Eternal had led an Emperor's Children strike force in an attempt to breach the inner defensive perimeter. The swordsman's pursuit of perfection had been corrupted by his exposure to Slaanesh, transforming his quest for martial excellence into an obsession with inflicting and receiving pain. The duel that followed demonstrated the fundamental differences between the two warriors' approaches to combat, with Lucius employing techniques that emphasized style and sensation over tactical effectiveness. The Emperor's Children champion fought with weapons that incorporated sonic generators and neural disruptors, their design intended to maximize the sensory experience of combat for both participants. His sword work displayed the technical perfection that had made him renowned throughout the Third Legion, but his movements were tainted by the excess that characterized his patron deity's influence. Sigismund's response was to employ the most basic techniques of his training, his sword strokes following patterns that had been refined through millennia of Imperial Fist's tradition. The climax of their duel came when Lucius attempted to employ a technique that would have been considered masterful by any conventional standard, his blade tracing a complex pattern designed to penetrate Sigismund's guard through sheer technical brilliance. The Imperial Fist's champion's response was devastatingly simple, his sword moving in a straight line that intercepted Lucius's elaborate attack and continued through to sever the Emperor's Children warrior's spine. The lesson was clear to all who witnessed it. Corruption and excess were no match for disciplined skill and unwavering purpose. Sigismund's third legendary duel occurred during the fighting for the Saturnine Gate, where Eidolon of the Emperor's Children had attempted to lead a coordinated assault that would have breached the palace's secondary defensive line. The Lord Commander's transformation through exposure to demonic influence had enhanced his already formidable combat abilities, but it had also introduced unpredictable elements that made him vulnerable to an opponent who understood the fundamental principles of warfare. The duel took place on the gate's battlements, with both warriors fighting while under fire from the ongoing battle around them. The combat between Sigismund and Eidolon demonstrated the Emperor's champion's ability to adapt his fighting style to counter opponents who possessed supernatural abilities. The Lord Commander's demonic enhancements allowed him to move with inhuman speed and strike with strength that exceeded even the capabilities of enhanced Astartes' physiology. Sigismund's response was to employ defensive techniques that channeled his opponent's enhanced aggression into predictable patterns, his sword work following forms that had been designed specifically to counter superhuman opponents. The resolution of the duel came through Sigismund's understanding of the psychological aspects of combat against corrupted opponents. The Emperor's champion deliberately exposed himself to what appeared to be a fatal attack, drawing Eidolon into overextending his assault in his eagerness to claim victory. The Black Sword's counterattack exploited the opening created by the Lord Commander's overconfidence, its ancient blade finding the gap between helmet and gorget with surgical precision. The sight of another traitor champion falling to Sigismund's blade reinforced his growing reputation as an unstoppable force in single combat. Jaghatai Khan's contribution to the defense of Terra took a markedly different form from the static defensive warfare that characterized much of the siege. The Primarch of the White Scars had struggled with the constraints of fortification warfare, his nature more suited to the open steppes of his homeworld than the confines of the palace complex. The Khan's solution was to transform his legion into a mobile strike force that could respond rapidly to threats anywhere along the defensive perimeter. The White Scars' first major intervention occurred during the assault on the Helios Gate, where a coordinated attack by Iron Warriors' siege engines threatened to create a breach in the palace's eastern defenses. The Khan led a lightning strike that emerged from concealed positions within the palace complex, his bike squadrons moving at speeds that made them nearly impossible to target effectively. The assault focused on the vulnerable rear areas of the Iron Warriors' siege lines, targeting ammunition dumps and command vehicles that were essential to the coordination of their assault. The tactical doctrine that the White Scars employed during these strikes represented an evolution of their traditional hit and run tactics adapted for the unique constraints of siege warfare. The Legion's bike squadrons moved through the palace complex using routes that had been carefully scouted and prepared in advance, their knowledge of the terrain allowing them to appear at unexpected locations and withdraw before the enemy could respond effectively. The Khan's personal leadership of these strikes provided inspiration to his warriors while demonstrating the effectiveness of mobile tactics even in defensive warfare. The second major White Scars intervention occurred during the Death Guard's assault on the interior Barbican's secondary positions. Mortarian's legion had deployed chemical weapons that threatened to contaminate large sections of the palace complex, their toxic clouds capable of penetrating even the sealed systems of power armor. The Khan's response was to lead a strike force equipped with specialized atmospheric processors and chemical neutralizers, their mission to destroy the Death Guard's deployment systems before the contamination could spread. The assault on the Death Guard positions demonstrated the White Scars' ability to operate in environments that would have been lethal to unprotected troops. The Khan's warriors moved through the toxic atmosphere with the same speed and precision that characterized their operations in clean air, their equipment and training allowing them to function effectively despite the chemical hazards. The strike force's primary targets were the massive atmospheric processors that the Death Guard used to deploy their chemical weapons, their destruction eliminating the immediate threat while forcing Mortarian's forces to resort to conventional tactics. The Khan's personal combat during these operations revealed the extent to which his martial abilities had been honed through years of warfare. The Primarch fought with weapons that reflected his legion's emphasis on speed and precision, his curved sabers moving in patterns that combined the traditional techniques of Jagorian swordsmanship with innovations developed during the Great Crusade. His opponents found themselves facing a warrior whose speed made him nearly impossible to target, while his blade work demonstrated a level of skill that few could match. The third major White Scars operation occurred during the assault on the Lion's Gate, where traitor forces had established a foothold that threatened to serve as a staging area for attacks deeper into the palace complex. The Khan recognized that conventional assault tactics would result in unacceptable casualties for the defenders, given the strength of the traitor positions and the quality of the forces defending them. His solution was to employ a coordinated strike that combined multiple elements of his legion's capabilities in a single devastating assault. The operation began with reconnaissance teams infiltrating the traitor positions to gather intelligence on their defensive preparations and identify key targets for the main assault. The White Scars' expertise in stealth and infiltration allowed these teams to operate undetected within enemy territory, their reports providing the Khan with detailed information about the traitor forces' strengths and weaknesses. The intelligence gathered during these operations revealed that the enemy positions were vulnerable to attacks from unexpected directions, particularly from the elevated approaches that the traitors had not adequately fortified. The main assault employed the full range of White Scars' capabilities in a coordinated attack that overwhelmed the traitor defenders through speed and surprise. Bike squadrons struck the enemy positions from multiple directions simultaneously, their rapid movement preventing the defenders from concentrating their fire effectively. Land speeders provided close air support, their weapon systems targeting specific defensive positions, while their mobility allowed them to avoid return fire. The Khan himself led the assault from the front, his presence inspiring his warriors, while his combat skills eliminated key enemy leaders. The tragic losses that occurred during these operations demonstrated the high cost of the mobile tactics that the White Scars employed. The Legion's emphasis on speed and aggression often placed their warriors in situations where they were exposed to concentrated enemy fire, their light armor providing less protection than the heavier equipment used by other legions. The casualties sustained during the assault on the Lion's Gate included several veteran sergeants whose experience and leadership had been crucial to the Legion's effectiveness. The heroic last stand of Captain Chin Za of the White Scars became legendary within Imperial lore as an example of the sacrifice required to defend Terra. The veteran officer had been tasked with holding a crucial choke point during the withdrawal from the Lion's Gate operation, his mission to delay the traitor pursuit long enough for the main force to reach safety. The captain's final battle lasted for over 6 hours, during which he and his remaining warriors held their position against overwhelming odds. The nature of Chin Za's last stand reflected the tactical evolution that had occurred within the White Scars during the siege. The captain employed defensive techniques that were normally foreign to his legion's doctrine, his warriors taking advantage of prepared positions and overlapping fields of fire to maximize their effectiveness against superior numbers. The defensive position they held was transformed into a killing ground where the traitor forces were forced to advance through concentrated fire from multiple directions. The growing influence of chaos corruption on the battlefield became increasingly evident as the siege progressed beyond its initial phases. The presence of so many corrupted warriors and the intense emotions generated by the conflict had begun to weaken the barriers between real space and the warp. The first major manifestation of demonic entities on Terra's surface occurred during the assault on the Mercury Gate, where a breach in reality allowed lesser demons to pour through into the material universe. The bloodletters that emerged from this warp rift represented a new category of threat that the loyalist defenders had not fully prepared to face. These entities moved with an inhuman grace that made them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons, their forms shifting and changing as they advanced through the defensive positions. The demons' weapons, forged from the essence of the warp itself, could cut through power armor and ceramite with equal ease, their supernatural properties rendering conventional defensive measures ineffective. The loyalist response to these demonic manifestations revealed both the strengths and limitations of their preparation for supernatural warfare. The chaplains and librarians attached to the defending forces had been trained to recognize and counter the influence of chaos, but their experience had been largely theoretical rather than practical. The techniques they employed to banish the demons were effective, but required time and concentration that were difficult to maintain in the midst of active combat. The first greater demon to manifest on Terra's surface appeared during the assault on the Eternity Gate itself, where the concentrated emotions of the conflict had created a nexus of psychic energy that weakened the barriers between dimensions. The bloodthirster that emerged from this breach towered above even the Primarchs, its brass armor reflecting the flames that surrounded its massive form. The demon's presence announced itself through the spontaneous combustion of nearby structures and the maddening of several Imperial army soldiers who looked directly upon its form. The engagement between Sanguinius and the bloodthirster became one of the defining moments of the siege, demonstrating both the angel's martial prowess and the terrible reality of the supernatural forces that served the traitor cause. The Primarch's golden armor gleamed in the firelight as he rose to meet the demon, his wings carrying him aloft to engage the towering entity on equal terms. The combat that followed lasted for hours, with both participants demonstrating abilities that transcended normal physical limitations. The resolution of this epic duel came through Sanguinius's understanding of the fundamental nature of demonic entities and their relationship to the warp. The angel's strategy focused on disrupting the psychic energy that sustained the bloodthirster's manifestation in real space, his attacks targeting the demon's connection to its source of power rather than its physical form. The Spear of Telesto, the Primarch's ancient weapon, proved capable of severing these supernatural bonds, its blade forged from materials that existed partially outside normal space-time. The banishment of the bloodthirster sent shockwaves through both the loyalist and traitor forces, demonstrating that even the most powerful servants of chaos could be defeated by those who understood their nature and possessed the proper tools to combat them. The victory provided a crucial morale boost to the defenders while forcing the traitor command to reconsider their reliance on demonic allies. The lesson was clear. The supernatural forces that served chaos were powerful but not invincible, and they could be countered by those who possessed the knowledge and determination to face them. The corruption of the battlefield itself became increasingly evident as the siege progressed, with the very ground beginning to show signs of warp taint. The blood spilled during the combat had begun to coagulate in patterns that suggested supernatural influence, while the air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent energy. The loyalist forces found themselves fighting not just against visible enemies, but against the very environment, as reality itself became increasingly unstable in the areas where the heaviest fighting occurred. The systematic collapse of the palace's outer defensive rings had taken 43 days of sustained assault, each fortification falling to the combined might of the traitor legions through a combination of overwhelming firepower and tactical innovation. The Saturnine Wall, that massive secondary line of defense that Rogal Dorn had constructed to provide multiple fallback positions, now lay in ruins across a front stretching nearly 200 kilometers. The debris from its destruction created a landscape of broken ceramite and twisted adamantium that bore witness to the most destructive siege warfare in human history. The traitor forces that now pressed against the inner palace walls represented the culmination of 7 years of continuous warfare and corruption. The Sons of Horus maintained their position as the spearhead of the assault, their tactical discipline enhanced by the gifts of the Dark Gods, while their gene siege showed increasing signs of mutation. The warriors who had once served as the Emperor's finest now bore the 8-pointed Star of Chaos prominently on their armor, their helms modified with additional Vox grills that amplified their battle cries into psychic weapons capable of breaking lesser minds. The Iron Warriors had established massive siege works that stretched across the approaches to the inner palace, their engineers constructing artillery positions and supply depots with the methodical precision that characterized all their operations. The 4th Legion's heavy weapons had been repositioned to target the Eternity Gate directly, their calculations taking into account the massive portal's construction and the void shield generators that protected it. Perdurabo's warriors understood that the gate represented more than a tactical objective. Its fall would signal the beginning of the end for the loyalist cause. The concentration of firepower that the traitor forces brought to bear against the Eternity Gate exceeded anything previously seen in the siege. Over 300 heavy artillery pieces, ranging from basilisk self-propelled guns to massive Ordinatus siege engines, had been positioned to deliver coordinated bombardment against the portal's defenses. The ammunition they employed included specialized penetrator rounds designed to exploit the microscopic flaws in adamantium construction, each shell calculated to contribute to the systematic degradation of the gate's structural integrity. The void shields protecting the Eternity Gate represented the most advanced defensive technology available to the Imperium, their energy matrices capable of absorbing direct hits from Titan-class weapons. The overlapping barrier systems created multiple layers of protection that forced the attacking forces to concentrate their fire on specific points, allowing the defenders to respond with coordinated counterfire. The power requirements for these installations drew energy from the palace's primary reactors, their massive plasma cores buried deep beneath the throne room itself. The loyalist defenders who manned the Eternity Gate's approaches represented the finest warriors that the Imperium could field. The Imperial Fists companies assigned to this critical position included veterans of the Great Crusade who had fought alongside their Primarch in dozens of campaigns. Their yellow armor bore the scars of 7 years of continuous warfare, while their weapons had been upgraded with the finest equipment that the Mechanicum could provide. These warriors understood that they stood at the final barrier between the traitor forces and the heart of the Imperium itself. The defensive positions that surrounded the Eternity Gate had been constructed according to Rogal Dorn's most advanced theories of fortress warfare. The overlapping fields of fire from concealed weapon emplacements created killing zones that forced attacking forces into predetermined channels where they could be destroyed by concentrated firepower. The approaches to the gate were covered by interlocking defensive positions that could provide mutual support while maintaining independent lines of supply and communication. The first major assault on the Eternity Gate began with a coordinated bombardment that lasted for 18 hours without pause. The traitor artillery targeted specific sections of the gate's void shield generators, their fire patterns calculated to overload the energy matrices through sustained pressure rather than overwhelming force. The defenders responded with counter-battery fire from their own artillery positions, but the sheer volume of incoming ordnance made it impossible to silence all the enemy guns. The breakthrough came when an Iron Warrior's siege drill finally penetrated the outer layer of the gate's adamantium construction. The massive boring machine, its drill head spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, had been operating continuously for 6 days to achieve this penetration. The breach it created was relatively small, barely large enough for a single Astartes to pass through, but it represented a fundamental compromise in the gate's structural integrity that could be exploited by follow-up attacks. The World Eaters were the first to exploit this breach, their berserker squads pouring through the opening with the frenzied aggression that characterized their approach to warfare. The 12th Legion's warriors had been further corrupted by their exposure to the siege's violence, their butcher's nails driving them to new heights of savagery. The Imperial Fist's defenders who met them in the confined space beyond the breach found themselves facing opponents who seemed to feel no pain and showed no fear of death. The close-quarters combat that developed within the Eternity Gate's internal passages represented warfare at its most brutal and personal. The confined spaces negated many of the advantages that the defenders' heavy weapons provided, while the attackers' enhanced aggression allowed them to press their assault despite sustaining casualties that would have broken conventional forces. The fighting moved from chamber to chamber, with individual squads of Space Marines engaging in desperate battles for control of strategic choke points. The Adeptus Custodes' response to the breach demonstrated the elite nature of these warriors and their dedication to the protection of the Emperor. The Custodian Guard had been held in reserve throughout the siege, their numbers too precious to risk in the outer defensive actions. The breach of the Eternity Gate represented the first time that these golden armored warriors had been committed to active combat, their presence announced by the distinctive hum of their guardian spears' power fields. The tactical coordination between the Custodes and the Imperial Fists revealed the extent of the preparation that had been made for the Inner Palace's defense. The two forces had trained together extensively during the months before the siege, their combined operations doctrine emphasizing the Custodes' individual excellence and the Imperial Fists' disciplined teamwork. The Custodian Guard served as elite shock troops who could be deployed to counter specific threats, while the 7th Legion provided the backbone of the defensive effort. The first custodian to engage the World Eaters within the Eternity Gate was Tribune Diocles, a veteran of the Unification Wars who had served the Emperor for over 2 centuries. His guardian spear moved with a precision that reflected decades of training in the martial disciplines of Terra, each strike calculated to exploit the weaknesses in his opponent's power armor. The World Eaters who faced him found themselves confronting a warrior whose skill exceeded even their enhanced capabilities, his movements guided by tactical awareness that had been honed through centuries of combat. The combat between Diocles and the World Eater's champion Kharn, the Betrayer, became a focal point of the fighting within the gate's passages. The Custodian's guardian spear clashed against Gorchald with impacts that sent shockwaves through the surrounding structure, while both warriors demonstrated abilities that transcended normal human limitations. The duel lasted for over an hour, with each combatant testing the other's skills in a display of martial prowess that drew the attention of warriors from both sides. The resolution of this epic combat came through Diocles' understanding of the fundamental differences between disciplined skill and corrupted aggression. The Tribune's strategy focused on exploiting the predictable patterns that characterized Berserker combat, his defensive techniques channeling Kharn's enhanced fury into attacks that could be countered and punished. The Guardian Spear's ancient blade found its mark in the gap between the World Eater's helmet and gorget, its power field disrupting the neural pathways that connected the Butcher's nails to their host's nervous system. The death of Kharn, the Betrayer, sent shockwaves through the World Eater's assault force, their tactical coordination collapsing as individual warriors succumbed to the rage that their fallen champion had embodied. The surviving Berserkers continued their assault with even greater fury, but their attacks became increasingly disorganized as they lost the focus that Kharn's leadership had provided. The Imperial Fists and Custodes' defenders were able to exploit this confusion to launch coordinated counterattacks that gradually pushed the invaders back through the breach. The Emperor's withdrawal from direct involvement in the siege's tactical coordination became increasingly evident as the assault on the Inner Palace intensified. The Master of Mankind's attention remained focused on the Golden Throne and the ongoing battle within the Webway, where the forces of chaos pressed against the barriers that prevented them from pouring into real space. The psychic energy required to maintain these defenses left him with little capacity to provide the kind of strategic guidance that had characterized his leadership during the Great Crusade. The Golden Throne itself had become both a prison and a weapon, its ancient mechanisms channeling the Emperor's psychic might to maintain the integrity of the Webway's human sections. The device's origins predated the Age of Strife, its construction incorporating technologies that even the most learned tech priests could not fully understand. The throne's operation required the Emperor's constant attention, his consciousness split between the physical realm and the psychic dimension, where the real battle for humanity's future was being fought. The Webway War that raged beyond the physical dimensions of the siege represented a conflict that dwarfed even the massive battles occurring on Terra's surface. The Emperor faced an endless tide of demons and warp entities that sought to exploit the breaches that Magnus the Red's warning had torn in the ancient Eldar construct. The psychic energy required to hold back these forces was enormous, drawing upon reserves of power that even the Emperor's vast capabilities could not sustain indefinitely. The demon armies that pressed against the Emperor's psychic barriers included entities that had existed since the birth of the Chaos Gods themselves. Bloodthirsters of Khorne led legions of lesser demons in assaults that sought to overwhelm the Emperor's defenses through sheer numbers, while great unclean ones of Nurgle employed tactics that emphasized attrition and corruption. The Keepers of Secrets that served Slaanesh attacked the Emperor's resolve through temptation and excess, while the Lords of Change that represented Tzeentch sought to exploit any weakness in his psychic defenses. The coordination between the physical siege and the Webway War became increasingly apparent as the assault on the Inner Palace progressed. The Traitor Force's attacks on the Eternity Gate were timed to coincide with major demon assaults within the Webway, forcing the Emperor to divide his attention between the two conflicts. The psychic resonance created by the violence on Terra's surface weakened the barriers between real space and the warp, making it easier for demonic entities to manifest in the material universe. The first major demon manifestation within the Inner Palace occurred during the assault on the Sanctum Imperialis, where the concentrated emotions of the conflict had created a nexus of psychic energy. The bloodthirster that emerged from this breach was larger and more powerful than any demon previously encountered during the siege, its brass armor inscribed with runes that hurt to look upon. The entity's presence caused the temperature in the surrounding area to rise dramatically, while its roar shattered reinforced glass throughout the palace complex. The Imperial Fists companies that engaged this greater demon found themselves facing an opponent that defied conventional military tactics. The entity moved with inhuman speed despite its massive size, its axe carving through power armor and ceramite with equal ease. The demon's supernatural abilities allowed it to teleport across the battlefield and summon lesser entities to support its assault, creating tactical challenges that the defenders' training had not prepared them for. The intervention of the Adeptus Custodes proved crucial in containing the demonic manifestation before it could spread throughout the Inner Palace. The Custodian Guard's weapons had been consecrated with rituals that dated back to the Unification Wars, their guardian spears capable of disrupting the psychic bonds that held demonic entities in real space. The coordinated assault by multiple Custodes squads gradually weakened the Bloodthirster's connection to the warp, their attacks targeting the demon's essence rather than its physical form. The banishment of the greater demon required the combined efforts of the palace's remaining librarians and chaplains, their psychic abilities focused on severing the entity's connection to its source of power. The ritual they performed drew upon knowledge that had been preserved since the Dark Age of technology, its components including sacred oils and blessed weapons that had been prepared specifically for combating supernatural threats. The demon's final scream as it was cast back into the warp could be heard throughout the palace complex, its psychic resonance causing several weaker minds to collapse into madness. The growing instability of real space around the Inner Palace became increasingly evident as the siege progressed beyond its initial phases. The barriers between the material universe and the warp had been weakened by the intense emotions generated by the conflict, creating conditions that allowed lesser demons to manifest spontaneously. The very air seemed to thicken with malevolent energy, while the shadows cast by the palace's architecture began to move independently of their sources. The loyalist defenders found themselves fighting not just against visible enemies, but against the very environment itself, as reality became increasingly unreliable in the areas where the heaviest fighting occurred. Weapons would sometimes fail to function properly, their machine spirits corrupted by exposure to warp energy, while the palace's internal systems began to show signs of demonic influence. The Vox networks that coordinated the defense experienced increasing interference, their signals distorted by psychic static that made communication difficult. The final assault on the Eternity Gate began with a coordinated attack by all 4 traitor legions, their combined strength focused on the single objective that stood between them and the heart of the Imperium. The Iron Warriors provided the heavy firepower that would breach the gate's defenses, while the World Eaters and Emperor's children prepared to exploit any opening that was created. The Sons of Horus maintained their position as the assault spearhead, their tactical expertise crucial for coordinating the complex operation. The bombardment that preceded this final assault exceeded anything previously seen during the siege, with over 500 heavy weapons targeting the Eternity Gate simultaneously. The void shields protecting the massive portal began to fail under the sustained assault, their energy matrices overloading as they absorbed more punishment than their designers had thought possible. The gate's adamantium construction, which had withstood 7 years of warfare, finally began to show signs of structural damage as the traitor artillery found its mark. The moment of breakthrough came when the gate's primary void shield generator suffered a catastrophic failure, its energy matrix collapsing in a cascade of feedback that destroyed several secondary systems. The massive portal stood naked before the traitor assault, its adamantium construction the only barrier between the attacking forces and the inner palace's most sacred spaces. The Iron Warrior's siege engines concentrated their fire on the gate's structural weak points, their shells penetrating deep into the ancient metal and creating fractures that spread throughout the entire structure. The collapse of the Eternity Gate sent shockwaves through both the loyalist and traitor forces, its destruction marking the end of an era that had begun with the Emperor's conquest of Terra. The massive portal, which had stood for over 2 centuries as a symbol of imperial might, crumbled inward with a thunderous roar that could be heard across the entire palace complex. The breach it created was large enough for entire companies of space marines to advance through simultaneously, opening the way for the final assault on the Sanctum Imperialis itself. The strategic situation that confronted Horus Lupercal in the smoking ruins of the Eternity Gate represented both the culmination of his greatest triumph and the beginning of his most desperate gamble. The breach of the inner palace had cost the traitor forces dearly, with casualty rates approaching 30% among the assault formations that had finally broken through the massive portal. The Sons of Horus alone had lost over 2,000 battle brothers during the final push, their gene seed irreplaceable, and their tactical expertise accumulated over decades of warfare, now reduced to empty suits of power armor scattered across the palace's approaches. The intelligence reports that reached the War Master's command post aboard the Vengeful Spirit painted a picture of impending strategic collapse despite the tactical victory at the Eternity Gate. Long-range auger arrays had detected the approach of Roboute Guilliman's Ultramarines fleet, their distinctive blue and gold hulls identified at the edge of the Sol system's heliosphere. The 13th Legion's numerical superiority was overwhelming, with over 250,000 Space Marines organized into multiple chapter strength formations that could tip the balance of the siege decisively in favor of the Loyalists. The Dark Angels under Lion L. Johnson remained unaccounted for, their fleet's last known position placing them in the outer reaches of the Segmentum Solar. Intelligence estimates suggested that the 1st Legion retained close to 100,000 battle-ready Astartes, their tactical expertise and advanced equipment making them a formidable threat to any traitor force that encountered them. The possibility of a coordinated assault by both Loyalist legions simultaneously represented a nightmare scenario that would force Horus to abandon the siege and withdraw his forces to defensible positions in the outer system. Most critically, reports from deep-range reconnaissance indicated that Leman Russ and his Space Wolves were approaching Terra along a different vector, their fleet having been detected by automated monitoring stations in the Kuiper Belt. The 6th Legion's reputation for savage close-quarters combat and their Primarch's personal animosity toward Horus made them perhaps the most dangerous of the approaching reinforcements. The Space Wolves' numbers had been reduced by their earlier conflicts, but their remaining 50,000 warriors represented a corps of veteran fighters whose loyalty to the Emperor was absolute. The time factor that dominated all strategic calculations stemmed from the traitor forces' deteriorating supply situation and the increasing influence of chaos corruption on their operational effectiveness. The extended siege had consumed vast quantities of ammunition and spare parts, while the corruption that enhanced the traitors' combat abilities also introduced unpredictable elements that made long-term planning increasingly difficult. The demon engines that had proven so effective during the assault phases required constant maintenance by Dark Mechanicum adepts, their mechanical systems prone to failure when the entities bound within them became restless or rebellious. The War Master's physical condition had deteriorated significantly during the siege, the gifts of the Chaos Gods extracting an ever-increasing toll on his mortal frame. The corruption that had begun on Davin now manifested in ways that were becoming impossible to conceal, with his once noble features showing signs of mutation that spoke of the warp's influence. His strategic thinking remained sharp, but the constant whispers of the Dark Gods made it increasingly difficult to distinguish between his own tactical insights and the alien logic of his supernatural patrons. The decision to lower the vengeful spirit's void shields represented a calculated risk that drew upon Horus's understanding of both his father's psychology and the tactical situation that had developed around Terra. The War Master recognized that the Emperor's withdrawal from direct involvement in the siege's coordination was not voluntary but necessary. His attention focused on maintaining the psychic barriers that prevented the forces of chaos from pouring through the damaged webway. The Master of Mankind's confinement to the Golden Throne created an opportunity that might not present itself again, but exploiting it would require drawing him away from his vigil through a challenge that could not be ignored. The void shields that protected the vengeful spirit were among the most advanced defensive systems in the Imperial fleet, their energy matrices capable of absorbing direct hits from multiple battleships simultaneously. The decision to deactivate these barriers left the massive battle barge vulnerable to attack from Terra's orbital defense platforms, but it also sent an unmistakable message to the loyalist forces. The War Master was confident enough in his position to expose his flagship to enemy fire, a gesture of supreme arrogance that was calculated to provoke a response from the Emperor himself. The lowering of the shields occurred at precisely 13:47 hours Terran Standard Time, announced by the gradual dimming of the energy barriers that had protected the traitor flagship throughout the siege. The change was immediately detected by the orbital defense platform's auger arrays, their targeting systems automatically acquiring the now vulnerable vessel. The tactical significance of this development was not lost on the loyalist command structure, but the strategic implications required careful consideration before any response could be authorized. The Emperor's awareness of the vengeful spirit's vulnerability came through the psychic network that connected him to the palace's command systems, his consciousness momentarily touching the machine spirits that coordinated Terra's defenses. The Master of Mankind's reaction to this development reflected both his understanding of his son's tactical acumen and his recognition of the trap that was being laid. The challenge was unmistakable, but accepting it would require abandoning the Golden Throne at the moment when the Webway War had reached its most critical phase. The consultation between the Emperor and his remaining loyal Primarchs took place in the deepest chambers of the palace, where the Golden Throne's ancient mechanisms hummed with barely contained power. Rogal Dorn's assessment of the tactical situation was characteristically direct, his analysis focusing on the military implications of the War Master's gesture. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists recognized that the lowered shields represented an opportunity to eliminate the traitor fleet's command structure, but he also understood that such an attack would likely result in Horus's withdrawal from the system before the approaching loyalist reinforcements could arrive. Sanguinius's counsel reflected his deeper understanding of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of the conflict that had torn the Imperium apart. The angel recognized that the confrontation between the Emperor and Horus was inevitable, their relationship as father and son making it impossible for either to yield while the other remained in opposition. The lowered shields represented not just a tactical gambit, but a personal challenge that struck at the heart of the familial bonds that had once united the Primarchs as brothers. The decision to board the vengeful spirit was made with full knowledge of the risks involved, but the Emperor's strategic calculus extended beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass the broader implications of the heresy for humanity's future. The Master of Mankind understood that the corruption spreading through the traitor legions represented a fundamental threat to the species' survival, one that could not be countered through conventional military means alone. The confrontation with Horus would serve as both a personal reckoning and a decisive engagement in the larger war between order and chaos that had been building since the birth of the Chaos Gods. The teleportation technology employed for the boarding operation drew upon the most advanced systems available to the Imperium, their mechanisms incorporating archaeotech components that predated the Age of Strife. The teleportarium chambers deep within the palace had been prepared for this possibility since the siege began, their targeting systems calibrated to penetrate the vengeful spirit's hull, despite the interference generated by the vessel's corruption. The process required precise timing and coordination, as the window of opportunity created by the lowered shields would not remain open indefinitely. The selection of the boarding party reflected both tactical considerations and the personal relationships that had shaped the Great Crusade. Sanguinius's inclusion was inevitable, his combat abilities and loyalty to the Emperor making him an ideal companion for such a dangerous mission. The angel's presence would also serve as a reminder to Horus of what he had lost through his fall to chaos, the contrast between his corruption and his brother's nobility potentially creating psychological leverage that could be exploited during the confrontation. Rogal Dorn's participation in the boarding operation represented a calculated risk that balanced his value as a combatant against his importance to Terra's continued defense. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists possessed tactical expertise and personal courage that would be invaluable during the mission, but his absence from the palace's command structure would leave the remaining defenders without their most experienced leader. The decision to include him reflected the Emperor's assessment that the confrontation with Horus was more critical than any tactical advantage his presence might provide to the siege's remaining phases. The teleportation process was inherently dangerous even under ideal conditions, but the corruption that had taken hold within the traitor flagship created additional hazards that could not be fully anticipated. The warp energies that permeated the vessel's hull interfered with the teleportation matrix, their alien influence introducing variables that the palace's tech priests could not compensate for completely. The separation of the Emperor, Sanguinius, and Rogal Dorn during the materialization process represented the first indication that the mission would not proceed according to plan. The teleportation matrix, disrupted by the supernatural energies that permeated the vengeful spirit, scattered the boarding party across different sections of the massive vessel. Each Primarch found himself alone in corridors that had been transformed by 7 years of exposure to chaos corruption, their familiar architecture twisted into forms that challenged both perception and sanity. The Emperor's materialization occurred within the ship's central command section, where the influence of the warp was strongest and the corruption most complete. The passages that had once been decorated with murals celebrating the Great Crusade's victories now bore images that shifted and changed when observed directly, their subjects transformed into blasphemous parodies of their original forms. The very air seemed thick with malevolent energy, while the shadows cast by the ship's lighting systems moved independently of their sources. Sanguinius found himself in the vessel's upper decks, where the corruption had taken a different form that reflected the influence of multiple chaos gods simultaneously. The angel's perfect features were illuminated by fires that burned without fuel, their light revealing walls that pulsed with organic rhythms, suggesting the presence of living tissue beneath the metal plating. The corridors stretched in directions that defied the ship's original architecture, their geometry following patterns that hurt to contemplate and suggested spaces that existed partially outside normal reality. Rogal Dorn's arrival point was located in the ship's lower sections, where the mechanical systems that sustained the vessel's operations had been corrupted by dark mechanicum modifications. The Primarch's tactical awareness immediately identified the changes that had been made to the ship's internal structure, his expertise in fortification allowing him to recognize the defensive preparations that had been implemented throughout the vessel. The passages had been modified to create choke points and kill zones, their design optimized for repelling boarders while channeling intruders toward predetermined locations. The corruption of Horus Lupercal by the Chaos Gods had accelerated dramatically during the siege, the War Master's exposure to the intense psychic energies generated by the conflict pushing his transformation beyond the point of no return. The physical changes that had begun on Davin now manifested in ways that challenged his fundamental humanity, his enhanced strength and resilience coming at the cost of his mortal soul. The whispers of the dark gods had become a constant presence in his consciousness, their alien logic gradually supplanting his own strategic thinking with priorities that served their cosmic agenda rather than his original goals. The final corruption occurred in the depths of the vengeful spirit's most sacred spaces, where the War Master had established a shrine dedicated to the chaos gods that incorporated elements from each of the four major powers. The chamber's architecture defied conventional understanding, its walls decorated with symbols that seemed to move when observed directly, while the air itself shimmered with barely contained warp energy. The ritual that completed Horus's transformation required the sacrifice of his remaining humanity, the final price demanded by his supernatural patrons for the power they had granted him. The entity that emerged from this ritual retained Horus's memories and tactical knowledge, but had been fundamentally altered by the process of apotheosis. The War Master's physical form now served as a vessel for energies that existed beyond the material universe, his strength and abilities enhanced to levels that approached those of the Chaos Gods themselves. The corruption that had begun as a means to an end had become an end in itself, transforming the Emperor's most beloved son into the ultimate champion of the forces that sought to destroy everything he had once fought to protect. The transformation's completion sent psychic shockwaves throughout the vengeful spirit, the vessel's corridors filled with the sound of reality tearing as the barriers between the material universe and the warp grew thin. The demon engines that served the traitor fleet responded to their master's apotheosis with mechanical screams that echoed across the void, while the lesser demons that had been bound to the ship systems gained new strength from the proximity of their patron's champion. The very structure of the battle barge began to shift and change, its architecture adapting to accommodate the presence of an entity that existed partially outside normal space-time. The corridors of the vengeful spirit had become a labyrinth of corruption, where the familiar architecture of imperial design had been twisted into something that defied rational comprehension. Sanguinius moved through passages that pulsed with organic rhythms, their walls bearing veins of dark metal that seemed to pump with unholy life. The angel's golden armor caught the flickering light of flames that burned without fuel, their unnatural radiance revealing murals that depicted the Great Crusade's victories, transformed into blasphemous parodies celebrating the triumph of chaos. The very air carried the weight of malevolent psychic energy, each breath a reminder that this vessel had become a nexus where the material universe and the warp intersected in ways that challenged the fundamental laws of reality. The prophetic visions that had plagued Sanguinius throughout his existence now came with crystalline clarity, each step through the vengeful spirit's corridors bringing him closer to the moment that he had foreseen countless times in his dreams. The angel understood with absolute certainty that he would not survive the confrontation that awaited him, his death serving as a necessary sacrifice that would create the conditions for the Emperor's ultimate victory. The knowledge of his fate brought not fear, but a sense of profound sadness, not for his own ending, but for the brother he had once loved, and who had now become something monstrous beyond redemption. The passages that led toward the ship's command center had been modified with defensive positions that reflected the tactical expertise of the Sons of Horus, their design incorporating lessons learned from 7 years of continuous warfare. Automated weapon systems tracked Sanguinius's movement through the corridors, their targeting systems enhanced with dark mechanicum modifications that allowed them to function despite the supernatural interference that permeated the vessel. The angel's superhuman reflexes and precognitive abilities allowed him to avoid the worst of the defensive fire, but each engagement forced him to expend energy that he would need for the confrontation that awaited him. The first major obstacle that Sanguinius encountered was a squad of Justaran Terminators guarding the approaches to the ship's central command section. These elite warriors bore the colors of the Sons of Horus, their cataphractii armor marked by the 8-pointed star of chaos, and adorned with symbols of their corruption by the dark gods. The combat that followed demonstrated the fundamental difference between the angel's noble nature and the corruption that had taken hold of his former allies. Sanguinius fought with speed and martial skill perfected over centuries, each movement a blend of grace and lethal precision. His opponents employed brutal, aggressive tactics shaped by their devotion to chaos, but they were no match for the Primarch's angelic fury. The Spear of Telesto moved through the air with unerring precision, its power field disrupting the molecular bonds of the Terminator's armor and striking with unstoppable force. Each blow was delivered with decisive intent, Sanguinius dispatching the traitors swiftly to clear his path toward the final confrontation with Horus. The resolution of the combat came through the angel's understanding of the psychological aspects of fighting corrupted opponents. The Terminator's enhanced aggression made them predictable in ways that their original tactical training had not anticipated, their movements following patterns that reflected the influence of their supernatural patrons rather than sound military doctrine. Sanguinius exploited these weaknesses with surgical precision, his attacks targeting the neural interfaces that connected the Chaos Warriors to their enhanced abilities while avoiding unnecessary brutality. The approach to the ship's command center required passage through sections where the corruption had reached its most advanced state, the very structure of the vessel transformed by exposure to warp energies that defied conventional understanding. The corridors stretched in directions that violated the ship's original architecture, their geometry following patterns that suggested spaces existing in more than 3 dimensions. The walls pulsed with organic rhythms that spoke of living tissue beneath the metal plating, while the air itself shimmered with barely contained psychic energy that made breathing an act of conscious will. The demon engines that had been integrated into the ship's systems responded to Sanguinius's presence with mechanical screams that echoed through the twisted passages, their bound entities recognizing the threat that the angel represented to their master's plans. These war machines had been modified with components that incorporated both dark mechanicum technology and demonic essence, their operation following principles that violated the fundamental laws of physics. The entities bound within their metal shells possessed intelligence that was alien to human understanding, their motivations guided by cosmic forces that existed beyond the material universe. The final approach to Horus's sanctum brought Sanguinius to chambers that had been transformed into a shrine dedicated to the chaos gods, their architecture incorporating elements from each of the 4 major powers in a display of blasphemous unity. The walls bore symbols that seemed to move when observed directly, their meaning shifting and changing as they drew upon the psychic energy of those who looked upon them. The air itself carried the weight of supernatural presence, each breath bringing with it the taste of corruption and the whisper of alien voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. The confrontation between Sanguinius and Horus began not with the clash of weapons, but with the recognition of what the War Master had become through his embrace of chaos. The entity that stood before the angel retained his brother's memories and tactical knowledge, but had been fundamentally transformed by the process of apotheosis, his physical form now serving as a vessel for energies that existed beyond the material universe. The corruption that had begun on Davin had reached its ultimate conclusion, transforming the Emperor's most beloved son into the ultimate champion of the forces that sought to destroy everything he had once fought to protect. The War Master's appearance reflected the extent of his transformation, his once noble features marked by mutations that spoke of the warp's influence, while his armor had been reforged in the fires of chaos itself. The Worldbreaker plate that had been crafted by the finest artificers of Mars now bore the marks of all 4 chaos gods, its surface decorated with symbols that hurt to look upon, and modifications that served no tactical purpose beyond displaying his allegiance to the dark powers. The Mace Worldbreaker itself had been corrupted, its ancient mechanisms now channeling energies that existed partially outside normal space-time. The duel that followed represented more than a contest of martial skill between 2 superhuman warriors. It was a confrontation between fundamentally opposed philosophies of existence that had been building since the first whispers of corruption had reached Horus's ears on Davin. Sanguinius fought with techniques that embodied the imperial truth and the nobility that had characterized the Great Crusade at its height, his movements guided by principles that emphasized honor and sacrifice in service of humanity's future. His opponent employed tactics that incorporated the alien logic of the Chaos Gods, his attacks drawing upon reserves of power that came at the cost of his fundamental humanity. The combat moved through chambers that defied conventional understanding, their architecture shifting and changing as the duel progressed, and the psychic energies generated by the confrontation weakened the barriers between real space and the warp. The Angel's wings carried him through three-dimensional maneuvers that exploited the enhanced mobility his unique physiology provided, while the Warmaster's corrupted strength allowed him to shatter reinforced bulkheads with casual blows from his mace. Each exchange tested the limits of both combatants' abilities, their superhuman reflexes and enhanced physiology pushed beyond normal parameters by the intensity of their conflict. The Spear of Telesto clashed against Worldbreaker with impacts that sent shockwaves through the ship's structure, the ancient weapons drawing upon power sources that existed partially outside normal space-time. The spear's blade, forged from materials that predated the Age of Strife, maintained its integrity despite the reality warping effects of the Warmaster's corruption, while the mace's demonic enhancements allowed it to function as both a physical weapon and a conduit for warp energies. The sound of their collision echoed through dimensions that existed beyond the material universe, their psychic resonance felt by sensitive individuals throughout the Sol system. The turning point in the duel came when Sanguinius recognized that conventional combat techniques would prove inadequate against an opponent who had transcended the limitations of mortal existence through his embrace of chaos. The Angel's strategy shifted to focus on the psychological and spiritual aspects of the confrontation, his attacks targeting not just the Warmaster's physical form, but the corruption that had taken hold of his soul. The Spear of Telesto's ancient blade carried with it the essence of the imperial truth, its power field disrupting the psychic bonds that connected Horus to his supernatural patrons. The final exchange between the two Primarchs lasted for what seemed like hours, but occurred in moments that existed outside normal time, their combat taking place in a realm where the physical laws of the universe held less sway than the force of will and the purity of purpose. Sanguinius's last attack pierced through the Warmaster's defenses, not through superior martial skill, but through the nobility of his sacrifice, his willingness to give his life in service of humanity's future, creating a moment of clarity that cut through the corruption that had consumed his brother's soul. The Angel's death came not as a defeat, but as a victory that transcended the immediate tactical situation, his sacrifice creating a crack in the armor of corruption that surrounded the Warmaster's essence. The psychic shockwave generated by his passing echoed through the warp itself, its resonance felt by every member of the Blood Angels Legion throughout the galaxy. The gene seed flaw that had always lurked within the Ninth Legion's genetic heritage was transformed by their Primarch's death into something far more terrible, the black rage that would plague his sons for millennia to come serving as both a curse and a reminder of the price that had been paid for humanity's survival. The Emperor's discovery of Sanguinius's body in the twisted corridors of the Vengeful Spirit marked the end of one phase of the confrontation and the beginning of another that would determine the fate of the Imperium itself. The Master of Mankind's reaction to his son's death transcended mere grief to encompass a rage that drew upon reserves of power that he had held in check throughout the Great Crusade. The psychic energy that he had been using to maintain the barriers within the webway was redirected toward a single purpose: the final confrontation with the son who had betrayed everything they had worked together to build. The approach to Horus's sanctum brought the Emperor through sections of the ship where reality itself had become unstable, the walls shifting between states of matter, while the air shimmered with barely contained warp energy. The corruption that permeated every surface spoke of the transformation that had occurred within the vessel's depths, its once familiar architecture now serving as a conduit for forces that existed beyond the material universe. The demon engines that had been integrated into the ship systems fell silent at the Emperor's approach, their bound entities recognizing the presence of a power that dwarfed even their supernatural abilities. The final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus took place in chambers that existed partially outside normal space-time, their architecture incorporating elements from multiple dimensions while drawing upon psychic energies that challenged the fundamental structure of reality. The War Master awaited his father's arrival with the confidence of one who had transcended mortal limitations through his embrace of chaos, his transformed physiology enhanced by gifts that came at the cost of his humanity. The entity that had once been the Emperor's most beloved son now served as the ultimate champion of forces that sought to reshape the universe according to their alien logic. The battle that followed represented the culmination of a conflict that had been building since the birth of the Chaos Gods themselves, a confrontation between order and entropy that would determine the future of human civilization. The Emperor fought with techniques that drew upon knowledge accumulated over millennia of existence, his attacks targeting not just the War Master's physical form, but the corruption that had taken hold of his essence. The power he wielded came from sources that predated the current age, his abilities enhanced by technologies and psychic disciplines that had been developed during humanity's golden age. The resolution of their conflict came through the Emperor's recognition that the son he had loved was truly lost, consumed by the corruption that had transformed him into something that could no longer be redeemed. The final blow that ended the War Master's existence required the Master of Mankind to draw upon reserves of power that he could not replenish. His psychic might focused into a single devastating attack that severed Horus's connection to the Chaos Gods while simultaneously destroying the vessel that had housed his corrupted soul. The psychic backlash from this ultimate effort left the Emperor mortally wounded, his physical form burned beyond recovery, while his consciousness flickered on the edge of oblivion. The Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne represented not just the end of his active participation in the Imperium's governance, but the beginning of a new phase in humanity's struggle for survival. The ancient device that had been designed to facilitate his work on the Webway project now served as a life support system that maintained his existence at the cost of constant agony. His consciousness split between the physical realm and the psychic dimensions, where the real battle for humanity's future continued to rage. The Master of Mankind's sacrifice had saved the Imperium from immediate destruction, but the price paid for that victory would echo through the millennia to come. The silence that followed the Emperor's final confrontation with Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit was not the absence of sound, but the profound quiet that comes when the universe itself holds its breath. The psychic shockwave generated by the War Master's destruction rippled through the warp, its resonance felt by every psyker in the galaxy as the champion of chaos was finally cast down. The traitor fleet, suddenly bereft of the leadership that had held their disparate forces together for 7 years, began to fracture as individual legion commanders struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of their ultimate defeat. The immediate aftermath of Horus's death manifested first in the behavior of the demon engines that had served the traitor cause throughout the siege. These war machines, their metal shells housing entities bound to the War Master's will, began to malfunction as their supernatural bonds were severed. The defilers and soul grinders that had carved through the palace's defenses with inhuman coordination now turned on their former allies, their bound demons seeking new hosts or simply rampaging through the traitor ranks before dissipating back into the warp. The sight of their own war machines attacking them shattered the morale of traitor forces already reeling from the loss of their supreme commander. The Sons of Horus, the legion that had followed their gene father furthest into damnation, experienced the most dramatic collapse. The psychic bond that connected all Space Marines to their Primarch had been corrupted by Horus's transformation, creating a network of shared corruption that amplified the Legion's tactical effectiveness while binding them to his will. The severing of this connection left thousands of Astartes suddenly bereft of the supernatural coordination that had made them so effective, their enhanced aggression turning inward as they struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their loss. Companies that had fought together for decades began to fragment, their officers unable to maintain discipline among warriors whose fundamental purpose had been obliterated in a single moment. The retreat from Terra began not as an organized withdrawal, but as a chaotic rout that saw entire formations abandoning their positions without orders. The World Eaters, already barely controllable due to their butchers' nails and corruption by Khorne, devolved into complete anarchy as competing champions fought for leadership of the Legion. The Emperor's children, their pursuit of perfection twisted into obsession with excess, found themselves paralyzed by indecision as they struggled to determine what constituted the perfect response to their defeat. The Death Guard maintained better cohesion due to their fatalistic nature, but even Mortarian's warriors began to withdraw from their positions as the reality of their situation became clear. The Iron Warriors, true to their nature as siege specialists, conducted the most organized withdrawal of the traitor forces. Perdurabo's legion had prepared contingency plans for every phase of the siege, including the possibility of defeat and the need for strategic withdrawal. Their engineers began systematic demolition of the siege works they had constructed, denying the loyalists the opportunity to turn their own weapons against them while covering the retreat of less organized traitor formations. The 4th Legion's discipline held firm even in defeat, their companies maintaining formation integrity as they fought their way back to the landing zones where their transports waited. The loyalist response to the traitor retreat was hampered by the massive casualties sustained during the siege's final phases. The Imperial Fists had lost nearly 40% of their strength during the defense of the palace, their companies reduced to skeleton formations that lacked the manpower to pursue the withdrawing enemy effectively. The surviving Imperial army regiments were in even worse condition, their ranks decimated by months of continuous combat against superhuman opponents. The few units that remained combat effective were needed to secure the palace itself and prevent any remaining traitor infiltrators from causing further damage. The discovery of the Emperor's mortally wounded form aboard the Vengeful Spirit marked the beginning of the most critical phase of the Imperium's transition. Rogal Dorn, having fought his way through the ship's corrupted corridors to reach the sanctum where the final confrontation had taken place, found his Gene father barely clinging to life. The master of mankind's physical form had been burned beyond recognition by the psychic energies he had channeled to destroy Horus, his flesh reduced to little more than a desiccated husk that somehow still housed his vast consciousness. The ancient armor that had protected him throughout the Great Crusade lay in ruins around his body, its adamantium plates cracked and melted by forces that existed beyond the material universe. The emergency evacuation of the Emperor from the Vengeful Spirit required the coordinated efforts of the remaining custodian guard and the most skilled tech priests of the Mechanicum. The teleportation systems that had brought the boarding party to the traitor flagship were barely functional, their mechanisms damaged by the reality-warping effects of the ship's corruption. The return journey to Terra proved even more hazardous than the original transport, with the Emperor's failing life signs creating additional complications for the already strained teleportation matrix. The materialization in the palace's teleportarium chambers was incomplete, requiring immediate medical intervention to stabilize the Emperor's condition. The Golden Throne, originally designed to facilitate the Emperor's work on the Webway project, was hastily reconfigured to serve as a life support system that could maintain his existence while his consciousness fought to hold back the forces of chaos. The ancient device's mechanisms, incorporating technologies that predated the Age of Strife, were barely understood by even the most learned tech priests. The modifications required to transform it into a life support system were guided more by desperation than understanding, with the Mechanicum's finest minds working around the clock to create a system that could sustain the Emperor's unique physiology. The Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne represented more than a medical necessity. It marked the end of his direct involvement in the Imperium's governance and the beginning of a new phase in human civilization. The master of mankind's consciousness, split between the physical realm and the psychic dimensions where the battle against chaos continued, could no longer provide the kind of active leadership that had characterized his rule during the Great Crusade. The burden of governing the Imperium would now fall to others, requiring the establishment of new institutions and power structures that could function without his direct guidance. Malkador, the Sigillite's final sacrifice, came as the emperor was installed upon the Golden Throne, the ancient psyker using the last of his strength to maintain the psychic barriers that held back the forces of chaos while the life support systems were activated. The regent's body, already aged beyond normal human limits by his psychic exertions during the siege, simply crumbled to dust as he channeled his remaining life force into one final act of service. His death marked the end of an era that had begun with the Unification Wars, taking with it centuries of accumulated knowledge and wisdom that could never be replaced. The establishment of the High Lords of Terra as the Imperium's governing body emerged from the immediate necessity of maintaining administrative continuity in the wake of the Emperor's incapacitation. The 12-member council drew its authority from ancient precedents established during the Great Crusade, when the Emperor had occasionally delegated specific responsibilities to trusted subordinates. The composition of the original High Lords reflected the various power centers that had emerged during the Imperium's expansion, with representatives from the Adeptus Ministorum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Navy, and other major institutions. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, found their role fundamentally altered by their master's entombment. These golden-armored warriors, who had served as the Emperor's companions and protectors for millennia, now became the guardians of the Golden Throne itself. Their duties expanded to include not just physical protection, but the maintenance of the complex rituals and procedures required to keep the ancient device functioning. The Custodian Guard's isolation from the broader Imperium deepened as they dedicated themselves entirely to their vigil, their numbers gradually declining as they received no new recruits to replace their losses. The transformation of the Imperial Fists in the aftermath of the siege reflected the psychological trauma that had affected all the loyalist forces. Rogal Dorn's legion had suffered casualties approaching 50% during the defense of Terra, but the survivors bore wounds that went beyond mere physical damage. The sight of their gene brothers transformed into demon-touched monsters had shattered fundamental assumptions about the nature of Space Marine Brotherhood and the reliability of their genetic heritage. The 7th Legion's famous stoicism became even more pronounced as they struggled to process the magnitude of what they had witnessed. The Iron Cage incident, which occurred in the months following the siege, represented the Imperial Fist's attempt to purge themselves of the guilt and trauma they had accumulated during the defense of Terra. Dorn's decision to assault the Iron Warrior's fortress on Sebastus IV without adequate preparation or support reflected his legion's need for redemption through suffering. The resulting disaster, which saw the Imperial Fists trapped in a killing ground of Perdurabo's design, cost the Legion another significant portion of their strength, but provided the psychological catharsis that their survivors required. The Blood Angel's transformation following Sanguinius's death aboard the Vengeful Spirit created a genetic flaw that would plague the Legion for millennia to come. The Black Rage, as it came to be known, manifested as a psychic imprint of their Primarch's final moments that could overwhelm individual battle brothers without warning. The affected Marines would relive Sanguinius's last battle against Horus, their consciousness trapped in a loop of rage and despair that made them effectively uncontrollable. The 9th Legion's attempts to manage this condition led to the creation of the Death Company, a formation of afflicted Marines who were given one final chance to die gloriously in battle. The White Scar's response to the siege's aftermath reflected their cultural emphasis on movement and freedom. Jaghatai Khan's legion, having chafed under the constraints of defensive warfare throughout the siege, dispersed across the galaxy in pursuit of the retreating traitor forces. The 5th Legion's companies operated independently for years, their pursuit of the enemy taking them to the furthest reaches of Imperial space. This campaign of vengeance, while satisfying the Legion's need for action, left them scattered and unable to contribute effectively to the Imperium's reconstruction efforts. The Great Scouring that followed the siege represented the Imperium's systematic effort to eliminate the remaining traitor forces and reclaim the worlds that had declared for Horus. The campaign lasted for 7 years, matching the duration of the heresy itself, and involved every remaining loyalist legion in operations that spanned the entire galaxy. The scope of the undertaking was unprecedented, requiring the coordination of millions of troops and thousands of ships in a campaign that pushed the Imperium's logistical capabilities to their absolute limits. The strategic objectives of the Great Scouring went beyond mere military victory to encompass the complete eradication of chaos influence from Imperial space. The Loyalist forces employed scorched earth tactics that saw entire worlds reduced to lifeless rocks rather than risk the spread of corruption. The exterminatus protocols, previously reserved for the most extreme circumstances, were employed with increasing frequency as the true extent of chaos contamination became apparent. The psychological impact of these measures on the Imperial forces was severe, with many units struggling to reconcile their actions with their original purpose as protectors of humanity. The Codex Astartes, Roboute Guilliman's comprehensive restructuring of the Space Marine legions, emerged from the recognition that the concentration of power that had made the heresy possible could not be allowed to continue. The Ultramarines Primarch's analysis of the conflict identified the legion system as a fundamental weakness that had enabled individual commanders to rebel with devastating effect. The solution he proposed involved breaking the legions into smaller chapters of approximately 1,000 Marines each, reducing the potential for any single commander to threaten the Imperium's stability. The implementation of the Codex Astartes faced significant resistance from several Primarchs, who viewed the restructuring as an attack on their independence and authority. Rogal Dorn's opposition was particularly vehement, his arguments focusing on the tactical advantages that large formations provided and the dishonor of abandoning the organizational structures that had served the Imperium throughout the Great Crusade. The debate over the Codex's implementation created tensions between the surviving Primarchs that would persist for decades, with some legions embracing the new structure, while others resisted it entirely. The Second Founding, as the initial division of the legions came to be known, created over 1,000 new chapters from the genetic material of the original 18 legions. The process required careful management to ensure that the new formations maintained the tactical expertise and cultural traditions of their parent legions, while adapting to their reduced size and independent command structure. The Ultramarines, with their large numbers and comprehensive organizational systems, provided the template for many of the new chapters, their influence spreading throughout the Imperium as their successor formations were deployed to garrison critical worlds. The disappearance of the surviving Primarchs in the centuries following the siege marked the end of the Age of Heroes that had characterized the Great Crusade. Rogal Dorn's death during a boarding action against Chaos Raiders eliminated the last of the Primarchs who had remained actively involved in the Imperium's governance. The Lion's mysterious disappearance into the depths of Caliban, Vulcan's apparent death and resurrection cycle, and the other Primarchs' various fates left the Imperium without the superhuman leadership that had guided it since its founding. The establishment of the ecclesiarchy as the Imperium's official religion represented one of the most significant departures from the Emperor's original vision. The imperial truth, which had emphasized reason and science over superstition and faith, was gradually replaced by a religious doctrine that venerated the Emperor as a divine figure. The transformation was driven by the desperate need for hope and meaning in the aftermath of the heresy, with the Emperor's sacrifice aboard the vengeful spirit serving as the foundation for a new mythology that portrayed him as humanity's savior and protector. The Inquisition's creation reflected the recognition that the threat of chaos corruption required specialized institutions capable of operating outside normal imperial law. The organization's mandate to investigate and eliminate heretical influences gave its agents unprecedented authority to requisition resources and override local authorities. The Inquisition's methods, while effective in combating chaos corruption, created a climate of suspicion and paranoia that permeated all levels of imperial society. The organization's independence from other imperial institutions made it both a powerful tool for maintaining orthodoxy and a potential threat to the very stability it was designed to protect. The technological stagnation that characterized the post-heresy Imperium stemmed from the massive losses sustained by the Mechanicum during the civil war on Mars. The conflict between loyalist and traitor tech priests had destroyed centuries of accumulated knowledge and eliminated many of the most skilled practitioners of advanced technology. The survivors, traumatized by their experiences and suspicious of innovation that might lead to corruption, adopted increasingly conservative approaches to technological development. The concept of the standard template construct became a holy grail that represented the lost golden age of human technology, while new innovations were viewed with suspicion and subjected to exhaustive testing for signs of heretical influence. The Imperium's transformation from a dynamic, expanding civilization into a static, defensive empire reflected the psychological impact of the heresy on human society as a whole. The betrayal of the Primarchs had shattered fundamental assumptions about the reliability of genetic enhancement and the trustworthiness of superhuman leaders. The response was a turn toward orthodoxy and tradition that valued stability over progress and conformity over innovation. The bureaucratic structures that emerged during this period were designed to prevent the kind of rapid changes that had enabled the heresy, but they also stifled the dynamism that had characterized the Great Crusade. The establishment of the Adeptus Archives as the Imperium's law enforcement agency reflected the need for institutions that could maintain order across the vast distances of human space. The organization's judges were granted authority to interpret and enforce imperial law without reference to local customs or traditions, their decisions backed by the threat of orbital bombardment for worlds that refused to comply. The Archives' methods were harsh by the standards of the Great Crusade, but they were considered necessary to maintain unity in an empire that had been nearly destroyed by internal division. The long-term consequences of the Siege of Terra extended far beyond the immediate military and political changes that followed the Emperor's entombment. The psychological trauma of the heresy created a civilization that was fundamentally different from the optimistic, expansionist culture that had characterized the Great Crusade. The Imperium that emerged from the siege was darker, more suspicious, and more willing to employ extreme measures to maintain stability. The price of victory had been the transformation of humanity's greatest achievement into a monument to paranoia and stagnation. The 10,000-year decline that followed the heresy was not a single catastrophic collapse, but a gradual erosion of the Imperium's capabilities and ideals. Each generation faced new challenges that required the sacrifice of some aspect of the Emperor's original vision, whether technological knowledge, territorial control, or basic human dignity. The Imperium's survival became its primary goal, with all other considerations subordinated to the desperate need to prevent another catastrophe on the scale of the Horus Heresy. The legacy of the Siege of Terra thus became not just the salvation of humanity from the forces of chaos, but the creation of a civilization that would spend the next 10 millennia slowly consuming itself in the name of survival. The Emperor's sacrifice had prevented the immediate triumph of chaos, but the price paid for that victory was the transformation of his dream of human enlightenment into a nightmare of eternal war and oppression. The Imperium that survived the siege bore little resemblance to the civilization that had entered it, its victory Pyrrhic in the truest sense of the word. The golden age of the Great Crusade was over, and the grim darkness of the far future had begun.